being the person who stops all the fantastic conversations that are already happening. Just to say, none of you will know, or very few of you will know who I am. I'm Jim Minton. I'm Chief Executive of Toynbee Hall, and my job is only to spend a really quick couple of minutes just welcoming you to our space. It's really fantastic to see you all here. And sorry, it's a bit weird, isn't it? It's a bit weird, like beginning to get used to speaking to groups of real people again, but it's so fantastic to see you all in this space. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Toynbee Hall for those of you. How many of you have been to Toynbee Hall before? Like one or two of you, great. So most of you haven't, but just to say, we are a place that was founded on the principle that we can really only solve the thorny problems that our communities face if we really try and understand it from the perspective of the people who are experiencing it. And I mean the people out here, the people across London, and the people beyond. We've been here in this very space here for over 130 years, and we were founded, Toynbee Hall was founded as a way of providing a different means to tackle the entrenched challenges of poverty that were around East London and London as a whole at the time. Poor housing, insecure employment, no access to justice, not enough food on the table, financial insecurity. You can tell where I'm going. Those challenges are still with us today, but throughout that time, we've tried many approaches and sparked real innovations with the communities around us. And hopefully you'll get a chance today to kind of explore the spaces, the gardens, the halls around us, because we've got some kind of evidence and stories of how that is. And it's fantastic to welcome you into that space and to think that, you know, your discussions today will be part of that kind of, in some small way, part of that history of shaping change together. For many years, we've worked on trying to understand and do something about the systemic barriers to financial well-being and the factors within communities and in people's lives and experience that impact upon it. And so it's particularly brilliant to have you and the Nest Insights team here today, because I know you're thinking about exactly the same issues as we are. Our focus is on bringing the experience of the people who come to our community centre, who come to our advice centre, who we reach out to in the many partnerships that we run both here in our local community and across London and beyond, bringing that experience to try and answer the real questions about where and why the financial system does drive people into further financial stress when really it could be helping building resilience, and how can we help people balance the current and future financial needs they have when the present always feels so precarious. So it's fantastic to have you here today. And I think as part of the agenda later on this morning, you'll be hearing from some of the people we've been working with to tackle some of those questions. And I know we'd like to do more work with you and with others across the financial health arena in partnership to tackle some of those things. So really fantastic to have you here. Delighted to see you all. And I think that's all I'll say. Enjoy your day and look forward to hearing what comes out of it. So over to you, Will. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 5th almost annual Nest Insight Conference. We're so excited after an enforced year off last year to be back with some in-person attendees. Really grateful for everybody who's made the trip here. I know for a lot of you it might well be your first in-person conference, and there's been a fair amount of shake hands versus elbow bumping confusion around the room as we started. I'm sure there'll be more to come. We're also excited but a bit nervous, I'd say, to be experimenting this year with a hybrid event. So most of the sessions today will be streamed as well as here in the room. So because of this, please do just bear with us as we're needing to do a few things a little bit differently. One of those is we're going to try, although we've already missed this slightly, to be pretty on time with the start of sessions, because we've told people who are streaming that when those sessions will start, so bear with us on that. Also bear with us if anything goes wrong through the day. Believe me, some things already have, including illness and transport issues, which mean that I think there'll be a few people joining us kind of as the day goes on. We may also need to be a little bit flexible with the timing, with the sequencing of some of the sessions later on. Okay, so just a few bits of housekeeping first. Can we get the slide deck on the screen? So a few bits of housekeeping. The toilets, hopefully you found them. They're down the outside and down the corridor. Refreshments through the day will be in the other room, and there isn't a fire drill planned. So if you hear a fire alarm, follow the green signs, and you should be asked to register to congregate out on the green outside and be registered there. So other bits of housekeeping. So we really want this to be an interactive event. Whether you're at home, let's see if this is working. No, could you advance the slide from the back? There you go. So we're really keen for today to be an interactive event. Whether you're at home or here at Toynbee Hall, you can vote on various questions we'll be asking you. You can put your questions in Slido and entering the code #NestInsight2021. There are QR codes for Slido on your tables as well. They'll be roving, for those in the room, there'll also be roving mics around the room for the discussion sections. You can also join us on social media if you're so inclined, again, using the #NestInsight2021. We will be using the polling function on Slido in the room, so if you could, it may be worth you trying to get the Wi-Fi hooked up on one of your devices. The Wi-Fi code's on the screen there as well. Okay, a few thank yous, important thank yous that I'd like to do. So firstly, to all our speakers for joining us today. We think we've got a really great, exciting lineup. Again, we're looking forward to hearing all the conversations. I'd also like to thank the Nest Insight team who've put in an absolutely Herculean effort in quite strange circumstances to get today's event up and running. And a huge thank you to Toynbee Hall and to Jim for hosting us. It's an incredible space. It's really inspiring. It's really in tune with a lot of what Nest Insight is trying to look at. So that's really a really great place for us to be. Sorry, can you advance the slide? Okay. And also, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our strategic partners, BlackRock and Invesco, whose support and funding for Nest Insight's work make events like today possible, along with our many project partners and funders who support our research projects, some of which we'll be talking about in today's agenda as well. We're always looking for new partners, especially funders, so if that's something that your organisation might be interested in, please speak to me or to Michelle or one of the team during the course of the day about how you can get involved. So for those of you who've been with us since the first conference back in 2016, you might have noticed, perhaps you haven't, it's perhaps a bigger deal for us than it is for others, but you might have noticed that this, a couple of months late, is actually our 5th anniversary as a unit. And I want to take a few minutes just by way of introduction to talk about some of what I think we've achieved over the last 5 years. So we launched the first of these conferences at Code Node in the city a few days after the Brexit vote. We were worried in the aftermath of that no one might show up. Thankfully, they did. And we had a really great first conference. And at that first event, we talked kind of almost exclusively, really, specifically and narrowly about pension saving and pensions engagement. We had a hackathon running in the background. Some of you might remember. That was, again, primarily about kind of gamification of pensions engagement. And since then, we've continued to do a lot of work on pensions and pensions engagement on really important topics, research into the role that life events play as triggers for engaging with retirement planning. We've explored the impact of the phasing increases on broader retirement saving behaviour. We've got a whole programme of work looking at the language of pensions and how to communicate pensions concepts to savers. Work exploring the impact of COVID on pension savings behaviours, which we'll hear more about today. And due for publication next month, work looking at the role of responsible investment messages and motivating engagement with pensions. So understanding and changing behaviours specifically around pension saving remains an absolutely core focus for us. But over the years, we've also moved beyond just that narrow focus on pension saving. The work that we're doing with DWP on long-term saving among the self-employed is focused on just that, long-term saving, not just pension saving, recognising that the locked-up nature of a traditional pension may be less well suited to the needs and psychology of the self-employed as a group. And you can see this even more clearly in our work on emergency savings in the sidecar savings tool. When we announced our intention to trial a sidecar savings tool back in 2017, the topic of workplace emergency saving was a pretty niche one, at least within the pension sector. But fast forward a few years, and now the links between shorter-term financial well-being and financial outcomes in retirement is a far more mainstream topic, both in the UK and globally. Our sidecar trial is live with 5 employers, and we published findings from it both last year and again this, and there's more to come on that in the coming months. We've expanded our focus to capture issues around the communications of workplace emergency savings, to work towards testing an opt-out version of payroll saving, and to look more at other aspects of people's financial lives, such as debt and the interaction between debt and retirement outcomes. Our work in these areas has been cited in US congressional committee hearings, by the Government Accountability Office, in papers by the World Bank, the OECD, as well as in many contexts here in the UK. And with our US research partners, the Aspen Institute Financial Security Programme, we're now moving on to scope some work around the interactions between housing and retirement incomes to expand this work. This is all part of a firmly held belief for us that for our target market of low and moderate income savers, the path to good financial outcomes in retirement runs through broader financial well-being and resilience in the here and now. and that it's incumbent on us as an industry to step back from a narrow focus just on more pension saving more of the time, to think about how we can help people to be financially healthier at a whole household balance sheet level. Through all of this work, we've kept a focus on two of the principles that we had in mind when we established the Nest Insight unit. First, all our work is for public benefit. It's published freely and widely as soon as it's ready. This is included through our retirement saving in the UK report, sharing the insights from the huge volumes of administrative data that Nest has gathered over the years that it's been running. And secondly, we've done all that work in partnership with others, in particular with academia, and we've been really fortunate to work with global leaders in this field: Shlomo Benazzi, David Laibson, Bridget Majorian and Andy Manny, Debbie Price is with us today, Lisa Bruggen, John Gathergood, Neil Edwards, many of whom are also speakers at this event in the past. Finally, what's been truly remarkable for us has been the support from the industry, from public bodies, from trusts and foundations. There's a real sense of coming together to solve the challenges of a population that were previously under-researched and underserved. And without the financial support that we've received, this important work almost certainly would not have happened. So we're really proud of what we've done so far, and we're grateful to all of you, representing both formal partners and collaborators, but also many others who've contributed to our work in a variety of ways, and we're super excited about what we can achieve over the next 5 years as well. Now, let me say a little bit about our focus for today. The global coronavirus pandemic has had a far-reaching impact on many aspects of our lives. Of course, most acutely and immediately, the loss of loved ones and the enormous pressure placed on critical public services, most notably the NHS. But as has been widely reported and discussed, the impacts of individuals on individuals and households in financial terms have also been significant. And they've been uneven. On the one hand, many people furloughed, or worse, who've lost jobs, have seen significant reductions in their incomes. They've had to rely on other savings, formal or informal borrowing, to make ends meet. On the other, people who've been able to remain in their jobs and keep their income while shifting to home working have saved, in some cases, significantly on costs such as commuting and going out. These are the accidental savers that we and others have referred to. The group have contributed to a massive collective reduction in credit card debt, for example, over the last 18 months. These impacts and what they mean for financial well-being and retirement saving will be the focus of our first two panels today. First up, we'll be surveying the overall landscape of financial well-being through and post the pandemic and considering the evidence around the direct impact this has had on levels of retirement saving in the UK. Then in our second panel, we'll look more at the links between financial well-being and capacity to save for retirement, and we'll explore the scope for innovation to support people in improving both. This afternoon, we'll pivot more to think about more traditional behavioural change. In our keynote from the fantastic Katie Milkman, we'll hear about the broad base of insights she's developed through her career and what she thinks those might mean for challenges around saving and retirement. And then in our final panel, in a way, we'll be coming back full circle to where we started all those years ago, the discussion about how to engage people with their decisions that they face, specifically as they approach retirement. Like I said, we're thrilled that we've got a number of you here with us in person today. We want to make sure the benefits of that for you are fully realised. So this morning, we'll be setting a few prompts for you to think about and to discuss over coffees and food. Hopefully what you hear from the stage will also prove an inspiration for that. And then we'll get some feedback from those discussions towards the end of the day. We hope a lot of you will stay with us for a drink afterwards. Okay, now hopefully almost on time. Yeah, pretty good. We're going to move on to the first panel, for which I'll shortly hand over to the panel chair, which I'm afraid is me again. But don't worry, after that, you'll be hearing rather less from me over the course of the day. So I'm going to welcome our first panel on the impact of the COVID pandemic on financial wellbeing. I'd like to ask our panelists to just come up and join me on stage. And I'll introduce them all properly in a minute, but while they're coming up, while we do that, we're going to test the technology for the first time. So, in fact, it may already have been tested in the background. So, if you could go to slido.com if you haven't already, enter the code #NestInsight2021, and you should see the following polling questions. How optimistic are you that we're going to build back better in terms of UK financial resilience? We're not going to discuss this in detail now. We're going to use these questions later on during the course of the day, but interesting to just set a flavour for the session. And not that optimistic would appear to be the conditioner for the session. So, okay, let's move on. So I'm going to join the panel up here. Seamless. Okay, so as I said in my opening remarks, the COVID-19 crisis had an impact on people's work, on their incomes, and on the cost of living. These effects have been unevenly distributed. Some people have found themselves being accidental savers, spending less on commuting and going out, but still working, and therefore ending up able to save more than in the past. Others have faced significant reductions in their income and have had to spend down savings or borrow to make ends meet. So this panel is going to assess the current state of the nation, what we've learned so far from the crisis, what it means for how we support people to build or rebuild financial resilience in the years to come. To help with that, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. So Firstly, Sarah Pareto is the Executive Director for Propositions, Insights and External Engagement at the Money and Pension Service. And Matt is also a valued partner of Nest Insight. At the far end, Tom Clarkson is Research Director at Blue Marble Research. And in the middle, Jessel Sheff is Postdoctoral Research Fellow in Economics at the University of Nottingham and Senior Behavioural Scientist for Nest Insight. So, Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you. Here's the control.
Right.
Hopefully, if you...
Do you mind if I go from there, Will?
No, that's
So I'm not
absolutely
gonna ruin
fine. You go
things.
ahead.
An organisation that looks at research and insights. We're also delivering live services, and like many of you, I'm sure, you've been trying to model and predict what might happen with customers. And what we've seen is everything moving to the right. So the demand for debt advice, which we initially thought would crystallise quite quickly, just kept moving right. And even now, we're not yet seeing that demand pick up. But as things like forbearance and furlough and the UC drop all start to come into bear, we're again still keeping our eye on what happens next. And of course, there are other factors now coming in, like the rising cost of living, energy prices, things we're reading about all today. So the collision of those things together, again, is not something we would have predicted. And also, we're looking into the spending review as well. So where might the funding fall? How might that impact the services that we deliver as well? But in terms of COVID, we saw, let's hope the clicker works, 3 Ds. So we looked at, in our research in May, we saw 3 Ds: deferred impacts, divisive impacts, and the impacts of digital. So I'm sure, as Will has mentioned, that the divisive part was seen very clearly. So divisions that we knew existed in society already were really rapidly accelerated, and the light shone on those really quickly as we moved through COVID. So as I mentioned, we assumed that the demand for debt advice would increase dramatically and quite quickly initially, but the number of debt advice consultations fell because, firstly, the sector had to adapt to the closure of face-to-face channels. So one of the first things that we were doing at the Money and Pension Service when COVID hit was trying to work out how we could keep services, debt services online, and in terms of just simple things like getting tech out to debt advisors. Government-led actions such as furlough measures and forbearance schemes meant that all of that demand for debt advice was kind of people were held in a holding pattern. Numbers are picking up now and are expected to grow, but we've not really seen the rush of demand that we were expecting initially. Job retention scheme obviously gave many people 80% of their income, but for some people they had even more than that. And for those in more financial stress or people that were already in financial stress, forbearance meant that bailiffs couldn't reclaim unpaid debts and landlords couldn't evict tenants in arrears. But obviously that is now something that's being eased off, and you will have seen stories about particularly how that's impacting tenants. Universal credit was obviously increased for a time. That £20 is being withdrawn again now, so we're starting to see the impacts of that. So we know that in the pension space, initially we were expecting to see lots of changes in behaviour, but again, we didn't really see a lot. So lots of the changes that we were predicting were deferred. So in terms of divisiveness, I think COVID, and we know this now, really divided society. So some people, as Will mentioned, were able to spend less money. Their they were at home, not paying travel. Maybe they had some costs around heating their home, but they weren't spending, eating out, going on holiday, and all of those other things. But so for some other people, the impacts were harder, and people were put in a very difficult position. So we know that young people really suffered. They were more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be unemployed, less easy to even launch their careers. Renters, especially private renters, have suffered and missed payments and have accrued missed payments. Mortgagees have sometimes used deferrals, but obviously they're going to start feeling the impact of that now. And we know that women and especially and parents, and especially single parents, struggled a lot during COVID as well. And we know that ethnic minorities were also disproportionately affected. So this was a really divisive pandemic. And as I mentioned, those inflationary costs now that we're starting to see, again, are likely to have quite a divisive impact. So they're going to hit some sectors of society more than others, and all of those things are going to collide. And lastly, digital. So all of us will have experienced this in one shape or form, I think. I talked about initially the digital divide around debt advice. So people that were used to accessing services face-to-face suddenly weren't able to. Services themselves weren't able to deliver face-to-face. And we saw it in our own homes with people trying to homeschool whilst also working from home, or maybe elderly relatives who were suddenly trying to give telephone support to help elderly relatives navigate financial services or health or anything else digitally. And that was just a challenge all across the UK for many people. And those people that were maybe on the margins of digital inclusion will have felt that heat more than others. So that we do think that the digital element of COVID was actually a really huge element. And I've now joined the board of the community board of the Digital Poverty Alliance in the last week. And I think the question now is, although there was this big highlight on digital and the haves and the have-nots in terms of digital, heading into the CSR and as the economy is recovering and healthcare is recovering, will that investment, there was a short-term investment and concern about digital inclusion, will that continue, or will it kind of go back under the carpet? So I think that's something to keep an eye on as well. So I don't want to hog the stage for too long. Well, this is supposed to be a short intro. So the big thing for us has been that time lag. And we're continuing to kind of update our modelling and predict what might happen next with customers. But as I said, there are just so many other factors that are coming into line that are colliding with the end of COVID measures. So we don't see this being a quick and calm return to normality. And our strategy has a 10-year time frame. It's looking at building the financial well-being of the nation over a 10-year time frame. And we think that long horizon is still really relevant here. We have to carry on focusing on things like financial education, which maybe has taken a back burner as we've been in a crisis environment. We still need to keep focusing on those things, which in the long term will provide the right societal shift towards a nation that is more financially well. Okay, thank you.
Great.
I should sit
Thank
down again now.
you, Sarah. So, Tom, are you going to stay there? Or are you... Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I think my job here today is to give a little bit of the human perspective of the lived experience of the pandemic. I work for Blue Marble. We're an opinion research firm, and we conducted a 12-month study, if the clicker works, a 12-month study during the pandemic to understand the lived experience financially of, if we can move on to the next slide, that'd be great. Oh, go back one. Thank you. A 12-month study to understand the lived experience of the pandemic. So we took a small-scale approach, a qualitative approach, and recruited 25 households to reflect a broad spectrum of society, and interviewed them every 2 or 3 months for 12 months from May 2020. And each time we went back to them, we sent them a short online task, first of all, as a check-in on how they were doing, and then had a 60-minute video call interview with them to really dig into what they were feeling, how things were going for them, what was going on in their lives. It was a broad-ranging study, and we focused on lots of different things, including the government's response to the pandemic, the financial impact of the pandemic, and also things like experiences of essential services providers. I'm not going to talk you through everything today. I'm just going to pull out a handful of quick points to get us going. So we mapped how people were doing financially as the pandemic progressed and as we went through each wave of fieldwork. Don't worry too much if you can't see the small diagram on the screen there. And the point is that we were following how people were doing in terms of their incomings and their outgoings at a household level. And what we saw, and I think consistent with what Sarah's just said, we saw a lot of stability. So a lot of the people in our sample, which was initially 25 households and then boosted to 30, stayed in a very similar position through the whole of the pandemic, with not a lot of change. But we did see some flux. And at the end of the year study, so in July this year, we reflected on everything we'd learned and identified 6 sort of broad typologies of how people managed financially in response to the pandemic. I'm not going to run you through these in detail, but there was a broad divide between what we saw as sort of stable typologies, where we didn't see a lot of shift during the year, and 3 turbulent typologies, where we saw significant upheaval, both good and bad, at different points in our 12-month study. The stable typologies, starting off on the left-hand side there, we had what we called the stable and confident, who were often more affluent, often a bit older, sometimes retired, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, had a pretty good pandemic financially. Income stayed the same or maybe even went up in a few cases, and outgoings massively reduced, as Will's alluded to. But we also had people who were sort of less affluent in that stable set of typologies. So what we called the sensible money managers, so people who were a little less well off, but had what many people would term good financial habits. So we're in the habit of saving, paying off credit card debt as quickly as they could, and so on. And we saw for them a lot of stability. And finally, people at the lower end of the income spectrum. So I'm thinking of a few people who I interviewed on a regular basis through the year, who on the face of it, you'd expect to have really struggled during the pandemic. But often a lot of our conversations with them were around how they were used to adapting and cutting their cloth to their circumstances. They'd faced a lifetime of adjusting to fluctuations in income. And although this was a big and significant upheaval for them, it wasn't fundamentally very different to their normal day-to-day lives. On the other side, we had what we called the turbulent typologies. Entrepreneurial opportunists were people who we identified who were younger often, potentially starting out their careers, and often saw financial opportunities. So I'm thinking of someone who I interviewed who at the start of the pandemic had been trying to set up a yoga studio, and he didn't give up on that ambition, but he added in a couple of different business opportunities that he saw or he thought he saw in the market. So he set up a gardening business. He also started an online business where he used social media effectively to generate a following. But he also saw some massive downturns, as did various other people in this category through the course of the year. We also had people who we called freedom spenders, who often had quite a difficult early phase of the pandemic and suffered significant loss of income at times. But as we emerged towards the end of our study in April, May, June, July this year, they might have found themselves back in work and feeling perhaps a bit more flush with cash. And they told us they were going to spend that on a treat. So whether that was a holiday or a luxury spend, like a bike or something like that, feeling like they had a bit of cash, but potentially some people might have said that wasn't the best use of their money at that point. And finally, there were some people in our sample who experienced significant financial shock, really, really struggled at various points in our study. And they often underwent a sort of radical journey in terms of their attitude towards money during the course of the year. Just 3 quick points I wanted to pull out. Some of these concepts are familiar to many of us, but I think they're worth restating in the concept of the pandemic and what we observed in our study. The first one is optimism bias. Many of you know this term, but what I think in the context of the pandemic, and particularly that first lockdown back in March, April, May 2020, it really was striking that we were talking to people about how they felt about the UK as a whole and the country, but also the UK economy, and they were often very, very pessimistic. And even if they supported furlough, were worried about how we as a country were going to pay for this. But when we talked to them about their circumstances, they were relentlessly optimistic and told us they would be fine, even if at that point they'd lost income, they'd been put on furlough, they potentially faced loss of their job. The second point was mental accounting. And we saw a lot of this, again, particularly in that very first lockdown, but also in the second English lockdown in November last year. People thinking about their money in terms of broad pots in their head without necessarily looking at the figures or thinking about them in detail. And people often showing a skew or a bias towards the pots where they felt kind of in credit or like they were doing well. So people telling us that they could afford to splash out on something because they were saving on commuting costs, even if we knew that they were on furlough and they'd lost 20% of their income. And the final trend, if we could just put that up on the slide, was the importance of household dynamics. So I think in many ways this would be expected. We'd expect to see patterns like parents supporting children, grandparents supporting grandchildren. But what really struck us was how kind of atypical household dynamics and friend and family dynamics were playing out. So when people were getting really worried about their finances or looking ahead and facing down the prospect of losing their job, they often told us about different dynamics that they could draw on to get kind of emergency cash potentially, or to save them, to help them out through a difficult period. We heard about things like brothers and sisters helping each other out, often people recognizing where they were in a stronger financial position than someone else and offering to help. So we heard about aunts helping out nephews, and also friends as well. So this wasn't always a family thing. Friends who knew they were better off or worse off than others, and drawing on those networks where possible. And just one final point from me before I wrap up is and something that really struck us. We followed people for 12 months. We interviewed them again and again. And often, in many cases, we didn't see a fundamental shift in their attitude towards money and their financial behavior. Often people voiced good intentions about things like switching or starting to put some money into savings, putting some money aside. And even if they told us that on numerous occasions, by the end of the year, we hadn't seen any fundamental shift. And it does sort of beg the question, with a pandemic, which was in many ways a sort of wartime level of upheaval and disruption, if people aren't going to change their behaviors or their fundamental attitude towards how they manage their money in that context, then well will they. That's me.
Thank you, Tom. And Jessel.
Cool. Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk about the economic impact of the pandemic on members of the Nest Pension Scheme. And I'm going to share some findings from our latest research. Could we have the slides, please? Thank you. And this piece of work is in joint collaboration with some of my colleagues at Nest Insight and the universities of Nottingham and Warwick. So the background to this is, since the initial shock of the pandemic, we've been exploring what this crisis means for people that are members of the scheme that save, and who typically tend to be on low to moderate incomes. And we've been exploring what are the challenges that face these groups of savers. And to explore these questions, we've been looking at the Nest data, which is an extremely valuable source of insight for various reasons. The first being, it is one of the few sources of extremely valuable large-scale real-time data on individuals that is received directly from employers. It has extremely large coverage, which is about over 9 million workers across nearly 900,000 UK employers. And the large composition of Nest membership is low to moderate income workers in the UK. So using this data, what we've done is we've looked at the impact of the pandemic on three broad things. One is, what is the impact on the pensionable pay of individuals, which gives us a good proxy to look at the impact on earnings, the impact on self-reported perceptions of financial well-being, and the impact on voluntary retirement saving behaviors. And today I want to give you a very brief overview of what we find with regards to these three topics. So first, let me talk about the impact on pensionable pay. So what we did in our previous analysis, which we also published earlier this year, and we found from that analysis that pensionable pay varied quite substantially over the course of the pandemic and across sectors. And we found that those working in retail, wholesale, and hospitality suffered particularly large decreases in their pensionable pay relative to those working in other sectors. So what we've done here in our most recent analysis is we have looked at pensionable pay relative to the pay that the member had a year ago, which is in, we have taken the pre-pandemic level pay as of Jan 2020. And we've looked at the distributions of these proportions across members. And this is what is plotted here, broken down by industry. Now, for example, if you take the middle column, we have pensionable pay plotted relative to Jan 2020 for those working in retail, wholesale, and hospitality. Now, if you look at Jan 2021 alone, don't think, yeah, the pointer works. We saw that the median person earned the same amount as they did a year ago. And we see some quite large decreases in pay as well. So over 50% of the people saw reductions in their pensionable pay relative to a year ago, and 50% saw increases as well. And in fact, the lowest quartile of people, which is indicated by the dark green color, saw decreases of pay of 20 or more percent. So from this analysis, what we found is that those working in retail, wholesale, and hospitality, and those working in manufacturing have suffered quite large decreases in pensionable pay during the third national lockdown, which is what is plotted here. And especially those in the lowest quartile of earners. We also see some quite large dispersions in these distributions relative to that in professional services, which we don't see much change in terms of the distributions over the months and relative to the previous year. But what we start seeing in April 2021 is we start seeing some signs of recovery where especially the lowest quartile of people indicated by the dark green starts moving towards the middle. So what this shows is that there are some signs of recovery in people's pay and the losses that they had suffered during the last few months and also the previous year from our previous analysis. There are some differences across groups where we had found that women and young people that were overrepresented generally in sectors that were most affected by lockdowns had suffered more losses, but they also now seem to be recovering from those losses. So this is some sign of good news. Next, what we've seen, sorry, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Next, we looked at perceptions of self-reported perceptions and financial well-being. And in this case, we saw perceptions about the effect of COVID on household incomes and perceptions around satisfaction and financial confidence across different groups. And we used two surveys conducted by Nest Insight, one in November 2019 and one in November 2020. And we found that the self-employed, the unemployed, and those that were unable to work due to sickness were significantly more likely to report that the pandemic had quite negative impacts on their household incomes relative to those that were in full-time or part-time employment. And this also tended to reflect in lower levels of financial satisfactions with their financial situation in 2020 wave relative to 2019. However, what we do see is that the perceptions about the importance of saving for an emergency tended to increase in 2020 relative to 2019. So we've seen quite a few changes in pensionable pay, in self-reported perceptions across of financial well-being across different groups. So we next wanted to see how do these actually manifest in pension saving behaviors relating to opt-outs, cessations, or withdrawals. And that's what we do on the next slide, please. In the next couple of slides, I'll talk you through some very high-level findings. So we looked at behaviors relating to opt-out, cessations, and withdrawals. And what we found is that there weren't quite substantial changes relating to these voluntary retirement saving behaviors. And we found, although there was a slight increase in opt-outs during the start of the pandemic to about 12 to 13%, it tended to normalize again to the average levels of in the previous year by the second and the third national lockdown to about 10%. The biggest change in opt-outs was among those who worked in firms with 250 employees or fewer, and those that were aged the mid-30s to mid-50s. We didn't see many changes in cessation behaviors, but what we did see in terms of withdrawals, next slide, please. In terms of withdrawals, we also did not see any clear patterns emerging. In fact, we saw quite large variations over the period in terms of the fraction of people that were withdrawing. Now, since the third lockdown, we have started to see a slight uptick in the fraction of people aged over 55 that withdraw. However, this fraction is quite small, or this increase in the fraction of people withdrawing is quite small. And it might be for reasons unrelated to the pandemic, because we see quite large changes even before the pandemic started. So this is something we're going to keep a close watch on. So just to sum up, next slide, please. So the economic crisis that is fueled by the pandemic, as we've seen, has had quite large distributional impacts on pensionable pay across individuals, on their self-reported perceptions of financial well-being, and we've seen some signs of recovery amongst these groups in the recent few months, and some signs of recovery in terms of the losses that they experienced previously. However, none of these impacts, either the losses they made or the gains they made now, are being reflected substantially in pension saving behaviors. So there's a story of not much seems to be happening in terms of pensions. So this got us thinking a little bit about whether the calmness that we have seen in these pension saving behaviors are being reflected elsewhere, which is, are people is there an effect on other savings of people? Is there an effect on debt levels outside? So this is something we're looking to explore over the next few months. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you to all of our panelists, to Sarah, to Tom, and to Jessel for some really interesting and thought-provoking comments. So we're now going to open this up to questions, both in the room and from those watching online. So if you're watching online, please share your questions using Slido. It should be clear how to do that from the stream. If you're here in the room, you can also load questions onto Slido if you want to, but you can also just stick your hand up. There'll be roaming mics. If you're asking a question in the room, please just wait for someone to bring you a mic. Just the other thing to bear in mind, for the benefit of those watching online, I will try and summarise questions or précis them or précis comments for the panel. So try and keep your questions as kind of succinct as possible, recognising them. There may be some longer things people want to ask. So if we could throw open to questions, please raise your hand, or I'll be looking Michelle's way at some various points here if there's anything coming in from online. While we're waiting, I'm just going to ask the first question if that's okay. Chair's prerogative. So, interestingly, kind of mixed picture coming out, both mixed in terms of the impacts of on different kinds of people in terms of kind of positive or negative, but then this underlying theme both of relatively little actual behavioural impact in the pension space. And Tom, you made a really interesting kind of concluding point about if not now, when, there's maybe not been actually much behavioural follow through in other areas as well. So I guess for me that prompts kind of two questions. Just welcome some initial thoughts from you all on them. So firstly, should we be surprised by that? Should we be surprised we haven't seen more of a behavioural impact given the scale of the impact of the pandemic? And secondly, should we be worried? Is there another shoe to drop? There were a few comments that people made about kind of deferred impacts, and is this going to come later? So do you think we should be? Is this really just a deferred impact, or might we see kind of smoothness going forward? So maybe Sarah, any initial comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I mean, as we know, getting people to change things around their financial behaviours is really, really hard work. And I think personally, going into the pandemic, we saw things like increased savings levels. There was almost an optimism of, would this be the moment where you'd see kind of more people saving? Will that savings habit stick, as an example? But I think what we've seen is that inertia is stronger than anything else. And so even if we might have expected to start seeing changing behaviours, inertia overrides that. I'm still hopeful that you might see, for example, in the saving space, saving, we know from evidence, is kind of addictive. So even though people were forced into saving in effect by not being able to spend, maybe that will stick. Maybe some of those kind of positive feelings about savings will actually stick, and we'll see that. We don't have any evidence for that at the moment, so that's complete, off the top of my head. But no, I'm not exactly surprised. But in terms of the second half of your question, should we be worried going forward? I think we're keeping a watching eye. I think the danger at the moment is lots of easing happening at the same time as these macroeconomic factors, which are new and are actually really big as well. And I think the timing of those are going to be really key. So something I saw last week was many of the big banks looking at moving people out of living in overdrafts long term, and they're actually putting those measures in place at the same time as UC dropping and forbearance dropping. And actually, if all those things collide at the same time, people are going to be forced to make trade-offs within their pocket. So I think that's the next big thing on the horizon, is these macroeconomic factors as we're trying to recover from what happened in COVID.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sam. Jessel, you're a behavioural scientist by background, so you surprised that a global pandemic wasn't a bigger nudge, or?
Yeah, no, I'm actually not very surprised by the fact that we didn't see much change happening in terms of pension behaviors. And as Sarah rightly pointed, it's probably a very strong nudge, and that auto enrollment provides. And people have actually not overcome this inertia to some extent to actually go and change their pension behaviors. But I also think it's also about the nature of the crisis that we've experienced. It's, I think, in some ways different to the crisis we've experienced previously. For example, if you compare it to the 2008-9 crisis, people knew that the lockdowns wouldn't last forever. People knew we would come out of it. So it's about sort of getting through those initial few months of maybe economic hardships and not touching their long-term pensions, which is for the long-term financial resilience as much.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of the nature of crisis and also the choice architecture being a bit too strong, which has worked.
That makes total sense. And I guess, Tom, that fits with the kind of optimism bias idea to some extent. Kind of maybe people rode out the first few months through optimism, and then it was kind of starting to normalize. But what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think when we started doing this study, people were telling us they thought they needed to plan ahead for the next 2 or 3 months in terms of lockdown and COVID restrictions. Obviously, it became apparent to everyone this was going to last longer than that. On the point around inertia that Sarah was making, I think it's interesting that auto-enrollment is built in many ways on inertia and actually benefits from that in lots of ways. And I don't think it's hugely surprising that, therefore, people haven't adjusted their pension savings. I think there's a broader question in the pension space about how well people understand their pension and how conscious they are that it's a lever they can pull and something they can adjust, in either direction. And when we were conducting these interviews with people over the course of the 12 months about their finances, it was pretty rare that people spontaneously talked about their pension as one of the things they were juggling or could adapt based on their circumstances, whereas, what they were going to do about their credit card debt, their potential savings options, and adjusting their household outgoings were much more top of mind, and much more sort of, I think, in consciousness about things that people felt they could adjust.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really, really good comment. And I suppose it prompts, maybe we may get some views on this from the audience, but it's both a strength and a weakness of something as strong as auto-enrollment, that on the one hand, all these kind of gains from pensions policy have been maintained, but there are probably people at the margin for whom that lever might have been quite a helpful one, and maybe they weren't kind of aware of it or didn't kind of seriously consider it. So that's an interesting kind of challenge. Okay, so I'm going to go to a question at the back here, and then I think.
Thanks. John Parker from Reddington. So we work with lots of sponsors and lots of pension providers as well, and we've heard quite consistent feedback from the pension providers in particular that in terms of voluntary pension behaviour, they saw quite a significant increase in voluntary withdrawals over the period. Now, the precise reasoning behind that isn't clear yet, but they're certainly seeing quite a big spike in people particularly accessing tax-free cash post-age 55. And I just wondered, Jazza, whether you have any evidence more broadly across the pensions industry, or I don't know whether there's anything particular about Nest's membership that meant that they, I don't know, weren't aware that they could access their pension savings earlier from age 55 as a source of potential income.
Okay, thanks, John. So just so a quick summary. I think John was saying that there's evidence from other providers in the pension sector that post-55 withdrawals have spiked in the pandemic, but we haven't seen so much of that. So Jessel, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think as you pointed out rightly, it might be a feature of the Nest membership for not seeing quite high withdrawals. But I also think it might be a feature generally in terms of behaviors of people, right? Like during the pandemic, we saw the values of pension pots going quite down because of market adjustments. And so when markets are low, the right economic thing would be to not actually touch your pension pots and let them be till markets recover. And that's why during the pandemic, I think we didn't see much happening in terms of withdrawal behaviors, which might be consistent. But in the recent evidence that I just showed a little earlier, we've seen a slight uptick, which is, I guess, a little more consistent with what you're finding from other providers. So I think it's a little bit of both. It might be being cognizant of market movements, and also just the Nest membership being different.
I mean, I just maybe add to that a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is, as Jessica pointed out, there's a lot of volatility anyway in withdrawal behaviours in Nest, and that's partly, I think, because it's still it's quite a young scheme. It's still relatively few people kind of passing the age 55 threshold. But I guess the other thing is, it sort of seems like, I mean, this is speculation, but it sort of seems likely to me that you're more likely to think of that as a pot of money if you're closer to accessing your pension savings anyway, and the demographic of the Nest membership means they're much more likely to work longer beyond 55, and so it may just not be kind of front of mind for them that that's a source of money for them, because they may, you know, if they view it as accessing pension saving, it may just be it's retirement, it's later for me, so that may be some of it as well. Okay, so Darren.
Thanks, Will. And a great opening session, and it's so nice to be back in the real world, isn't it? I'm Darren Philp. I'm Director of Policy at Smart Pension. I just wanted to sort of pick up on the inertia theme, because and explore a bit as to, you know, what are the implications of that for sort of wider initiatives, government policy, you know, what MAPs do in the future. So, you know, there's always been this debate in pensions about the power of inertia versus the need to engage. And I'm just wondering if the panel think that, you know, there are some strong lessons from the pandemic and the construction of auto-enrollment that we should be feeding into sort of thinking that's going on at the moment, as particularly around engagement. You know, I'm thinking about ideas like a statement season and things like that, which if you do sort of promote stuff like that, and if you know, and it's good to promote pensions, we want people to have the connection with pensions, could it have some unintended consequences? So just really to sort of explore that debate a bit between inertia and that engagement, and, you know, what the lessons from the pandemic on that are.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Darren, I think where we're driving at there is, what's the trade-off between, on the one hand, we've seen inertia be really powerful, as we were discussing, that's both a positive and a negative in some senses, versus on the other hand, the risk that therefore when you try to engage people more, it could have both positive and negative consequences in terms of their behaviour. So who wants to
I'm happy to
first?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know inertia is a blessing and a curse, isn't it? So obviously the obvious trade-off to me is in the pensions context is you have people who are not withdrawing, not coming out of that positive behaviour, but also not engaging and not understanding and not sort of owning their pension. So that might be a challenge later on, and also means that people aren't looking at things like adequacy in the short term. So I can see the disbenefits. In terms of, for us, we are also looking at ways to, I guess, latch on to what we know about inertia. So sidecar savings being a good example of where we're working with you guys to test something, which is if you start paying into a liquid savings pot, which is attached to your pension. So it's using that same principle of inertia and saying, can that have an impact on short-term liquid savings? And hopefully the answer will be yes once we carry on testing it. So yeah, so it is a big trade-off though. And, you know, we know one of our national goals is people knowing enough to plan for and in retirement. And in creating that goal, we were very mindful of the fact that we do need people to engage throughout their lifetime. So things like midlife MOT is a way to actually start getting people to think about their pension being theirs. I know everyone tells a taxi driver story, but I've got a taxi driver story too, which is the taxi driver that drove me up this morning. She was talking about her pension, which I think is with Nest. And she sort of didn't know it was hers, because she's just been told she has to pay into this thing. So she just thinks it's a rule she has to follow. And she was unaware that this pension belonged to her and that she had some sort of agency over it. And that's the perfect example, isn't it? That she probably wouldn't have thought of opting out, because to her, in her mind, she's followed a course of action that someone's told her she has to do, and it maybe belongs to someone else. And that complete lack of agency, I don't think is that uncommon.
Don't feel compelled, but any further comments, Tom or Jessel?
Sarah sort of beat me to it with the sidecar savings tool. I think, you know, it was pretty clear to us from the very first round of interviews that we did in our research that people wanted a short-term savings buffer and realised they didn't have it, and it suddenly became apparent to them how important it would have been to have had, you know, a few £100s, £1,000 sitting there to use. And so things like the sidecar savings tool seem to me like a really useful way potentially to build up that buffer, building on the inertia idea. I think the other thing here is that as you've mentioned, auto-enrollment is a very powerful tool, and it was pretty clear to us in our study there were some people who really could have used an additional few £100s at certain points in the pandemic and actually had to make some quite bad, on the face of it, financial decisions about taking out short-term loans, payday loans, and so on to stave off a shortfall when a little bit less pension saving for a few months might not have been the worst thing in the world.
The only thing I think I would add is it's true that inertia is sort of like a double-edged sword in a way, because while it can help longer-term financial well-being, it can also have implications on shorter-term financial resilience if, for example, people go and borrow from and take on high-cost credit to fund their lack of or their deficit in consumption. And I think what's come out of our research is, especially after the pandemic, we've seen perceptions of saving for an emergency being quite a lot more important among people compared to a year ago, which is quite striking and also gives some really nice credibility to a hybrid savings tool, for example, like Sidecar. So I think it's about how do you manage inertia in a way that capitalizes on people's ability to not act, but at the same time keep their overall financial resilience in mind and increase their utility, overall lifetime utility.
Great, thanks. So I'm conscious the layout of the room is pointing me here, and I don't want to ignore this side of the room, but I also don't want to ignore the people watching the stream. So I'm going to take a question from the stream, and then I'm going to make sure that if there are questions from here, we do those next. So, Michelle.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions from home or offices. One specifically for Tom, which is, of your 25 households, did those aged 55 and over give any views on their retirement planning? So did you see any consideration of retirement income needs and COVID impact? And there's a second, more general question. Do any of the panelists have a view around debt consolidation and whether there was any change or increase in people consolidating debt at lower rates?
Okay, so for Tom first, was there anything specific on retirement coming through from any of your 25 households?
Yeah, we had several people in the sample who were over 55. A few people at the sort of more affluent end of the spectrum were seemed largely unaffected. Obviously, we joined them post-pandemic or post initial lockdown, but they told us they hadn't really changed their plans. One person said he had quite a sizable pension pot, and if anything, it meant he was going to take longer to actually access that because, as Jessa was saying, the value of his pot had diminished massively in those first few weeks. We did see one person I interviewed who was really not very well off at all and was really struggling financially, had a very small pension pot, I think about £3,000. And at one point in the pandemic, she decided to cash that in and withdraw that to pay off a shortfall in her sort of day-to-day living expenses. And I think in the short term, that gave her some relief, but also meant she had no real pot left to draw on.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tom. And maybe Sarah, any views on debt consolidation behaviours? Is that something you've seen any evidence of?
No, I mean, we've definitely seen this kind of holding pattern in behaviours around debt advice generally. So expecting demand to crystallise, it hasn't crystallised. But debt consolidation is something that's always a live issue of can we do more in that space? And I know Fair for All Finance are looking at that space. Is there more we can do in debt consolidation?
Yeah. And I know that certainly kind of earlier in the pandemic, there was quite a big net reduction in debt, particularly around credit card debt. Like a lot of people just paid off credit cards. But I suspect, as we've seen, that was people, more affluent people, just taking the opportunity to wipe out balances and that kind of maybe hides some more challenging kind of debt circumstances in the lower end of the income spectrum. Okay, I'm turning this way. So do we have any questions from the left hand to my side of the room? Debbie, just mic on its way to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for a really fascinating start to the morning. Tom, my question's for you. I was fascinated by your typologies, and I wondered if you had any views about if someone was of modest income, say, they could either fall into the top three or the bottom three, and that was true across the piece. What made someone more likely to be in the top three than in the bottom three?
Okay, so that was the typologies Tom talked about, and the kind of more stable ones and the less stable ones. And I think, Tom, you were saying, anyone could be in anyone, at least on an income level, could be in any of those categories. So what were the underlying drivers that you found?
Yeah, a big question. I think for us, what was clear is, there's something in your fundamental attitude towards money that is independent potentially of your sort of circumstances, that may come to you through your parents or influences on you when you're growing up, about whether you think, having debt is a good thing, whether you're one of those people who wants to pay off their credit card debt quickly, or whether you're happy to let it ride, those sorts of things. It seemed to us that the difference between the people in the more stable bracket versus the more turbulent were sort of longer lifetime influences rather than the specific demographics of where they were in their life, or whether they were in a well-paying job or less or more fragile job or whatever. It's that fundamental mindset about money, which, as I said, we didn't see a lot of change in through the whole of the study, except for a handful of people who had experienced significant financial shock and suddenly thought, actually, I should build up a pot for the future if I can, or whatever.
Great. Okay. And I think there's another question.
Thank you. Dan Morris, Wells Fargo Asset Management. Tom, a couple of questions ago, you gave a reference to somebody that had a pension pot that fell in value, and they looked at that. It made me think some of the other comments that we've heard from the panel have been about inertia, and if not change, then when. And Sarah, you also spoke about digital, and we see a lot of people now looking at investment data very quickly, and it's rapid and it's real time. So on one hand, you've got real-time information about something which is now, but the pension's a long, long away. And there's a lack of inertia and people are not changing. How do you view that? How do you try and square that as you think about your research and the decisions people make?
Okay, can I repeat that in a so how do we square it's actually to some extent I think relates to Darren's question, how do we square the kind of growth in real-time information around things like asset values with sort of behavior inertia, both good and bad? Is that a fair? Okay, good, excellent. And Tom, and then welcome kind of comments from anyone else.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing here. There's a divide between people who don't look at this information very much, and certainly we see a lot of people who either bury their heads in the sand or it's just not on their radar. They've got so many other competing interests in their life and competing things on their mind, versus the people who are keeping an eye on things but not actually doing anything and not taking any action, which is what you're referring to. And in the latter case, I think the context of the pandemic, as Jessica was saying, is important in that people weren't sure how long it was going to last, but thought it was probably a short-term thing. And there's that sort of desire or impulse to just sit things out, sit on it a bit longer, wait and see what's happening. And I think for pension pots, read also current accounts and how people are feeling about their broader financial situation, in that there is a portion of people who look at this stuff but are thinking, I'll just wait another month, or I'll get another pay packet in, as to before they take action. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an attempt.
Sure, and just Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's probably at the highly engaged end of the consumer that's actually following that data. But yeah, to add to what Tom was saying, there's consumers who are not engaged at all in that way, and then there's a smaller cohort maybe who are tracking that data and looking at it. But across both of those, I would say inertia still plays a part. So it's probably a very tiny minority will combine both and look at the data and act on it.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that is, like Sarah was saying, it's only a small proportion of people that actually track market movements very closely, and they, in the more economics language, they're the sophisticated kind of people that do this tracking, and maybe they're also more cognizant of their behavioral biases, like loss aversion, for example, where they know they shouldn't really touch their pots until it sort of recovers to the pre-pandemic levels or the normal levels. So I think it wasn't inertia probably, and amongst that group of people that made them not react to this kind of information, but it was probably more of a conscious choice if people were aware of some of their biases or behaviors.
So I'm going to take Chair's prerogative, and I'm also going to give an answer to this question, but then after that, I think Anne's got a question. So I think just linking with Darren's comments and yours, this does seem to me, even before the pandemic, this does seem to me to be kind of the kind of coming debate in pensions, which is ironic because we had it before, right, back in pre-auto enrollment, this whole debate about engagement, and is it, how do we want it, do we not want it, if we do it, will it influence behaviour? And there's in Vanguard's how America Saves research series, they showed that basically almost everybody who makes an active choice of fund in their 401k systems ends up introducing more volatility for no increase in return. Right, they do things like shift all their money into kind of home biased equities, and they basically don't gain. But on the other hand, we know that kind of 8% automatic enrollment contributions is kind of not enough for some, and may actually be too much for others, and we have to kind of try and get more help people get more kind of laser guide in what they do. So I think this is, even without the pandemic, I think kind of figuring out what's the right mix of nudges, and is digital an opportunity, or is it too high touch for something like pensions, and where do we take all that seems to me like it's a very fertile area for future consideration. Okay, Anne had a question.
So I used to work at Nest, obviously the land of inertia, now almost at the other end of the spectrum in terms of engagement. But I think just sharing a reflection of some of our clients during the pandemic, where basically we saw probably around start to invest for the first time. And I think using that lockdown as an opportunity to reassess their savings. There'd been a very low interest rate environment for a very long time, people starting to actually wanting to actively save. And I think I joined at Hargreaves in March of this year and learned very rapidly that whilst I was watching Netflix on lockdown, many other people were actively investing and saving. And I thought, well, maybe I should have been doing that. So I do think there are different personality types at play here, as well as the type of money and resource that you have to do things. But certainly within that new client base is a lot younger. So 83% of our new clients over the last year are under 55, for instance. And I do think as we're moving towards a sort of a younger generation that will need to save and invest for retirement and aren't relying on those DB pensions, I think this whole debate around how you engage people well and make sure that they're, making the right decisions and the right kind of nudges versus the power of inertia, I think is ever more important, to sort of bring that out and to recognise actually some wealthy people won't necessarily be that engaged in the same way that some people with less money actually might be much easier to engage. So I don't think it's just straight related to how much cash you have at any particular time.
Yeah, no, great, thanks, Anne. So just I mean, and for the stream, Anne saying that Hargreaves Lansdown have seen 300,000 new investors and people reevaluating the benefits of traditional saving versus investing. I think it goes to show, we have to be careful in a large population. Kind of, we summarise trends. Largely, people have been inert. Kind of, largely, we haven't seen that much, and yet you still see very high absolute numbers of people doing different things because it's a large population that we're dealing with, and it just goes to the sort of differential impacts point. And any comments on any of the last couple of bits of discussion? Otherwise, I think we've got time for one more question. Does anyone? We've got one more at the back.
To paraphrase and generalise a little, it's felt like there's been in some quite a remarkable level of resilience in a lot of areas of kind of savings behaviour. Do you envisage, as some of the government support comes off, that if we did this in 6-12 months' time, the picture might be kind of slightly different, maybe even worse than what we've seen so far?
Okay, so that's thus far we've seen a lot of resilience. It comes back to this idea of deferred issues. I guess we've seen a lot of resilience. Do we anticipate, if we have this panel again in 12 months' time, which, by the way, we may, do we expect to have seen very different behaviours? And that feels like a good kind of final summing up point for each of you as well. So, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, we're still continuing to prepare for an uptick in debt advice, which gives you a good indicator that we think there is trouble ahead. And as I said, we're now looking at other factors, fuel cost rises and things. Our target market is squeezed and struggling families. So all of those other factors are going to have a big impact on people's households. And, sometimes we plan really heavily for things which don't end up being such a big blip as we expect. So the UC removal of the £20, for example, Michael, who's sitting over there, has been spending months planning for that. And actually, it's been less of a blip than people were expecting. So, I mean, just to kind of turn it into a positive, I think it would be a shame for all of us if we didn't capitalise on some of the positive sides of, Tom talking about people recognising that they need a liquid savings buffer. So how do we kind of capture that? People who have started saving, how do we capture that? As well as obviously managing the kind of crisis and continuing to manage the crisis. So I do think it's an opportunity for financial wellbeing as a whole to actually pull on some of those threads that we saw through COVID and build upon them.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question because we've started seeing some recovery in the labor market more generally, where vacancies have picked up, unemployment levels have gone down, employment rates have gone up, average wage growth is sort of picking up again. So looking at those aspects, I'm pretty optimistic in terms of what is going to happen in terms of labor market indicators going forward, and therefore what might happen in terms of savings or pension savings more specifically. And I think if a big crisis like the pandemic and the economic impacts of it didn't really change pension behaviors, it's hard to think or imagine there to be quite large impacts as we wind down from it. So I think my prediction would be we might not see that big impacts or substantial impacts as furlough winds down.
Thank you, Jess.
And probably two quick points for me to finish. The one thing I haven't really talked about very much this morning is the importance of furlough and just how fundamental that was to enabling a lot of resilience where perhaps we might not have expected it. And we actually started our study with the intention of carrying on beyond the initial planned end of furlough to see what happened at that stage. And we extended the study and then eventually had to bring it to a close before furlough ended. And I think if we were to go back to our people now and over the next few months, we may start to see some different impacts, particularly on those lower income people, if people have lost their jobs or incomes have been significantly reduced. And the second sort of more positive point to build on Sarah's point is there's a lot of talk in the world of financial education about teachable moments, and they're usually conceived as life stages, leaving home, moving in with a partner and so on, as moments where you can actually get people to change their financial behavior or mindset. And if the pandemic is anything, it's probably a teachable moment that isn't a life stage, and that you can explain to people and give them real examples of where a savings buffer would be useful or where a different course of behavior might actually yield some more positive results in the future.
Great, thank you, Tom. Great place to finish. So firstly, can I ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists for the first panel this morning? We're just about to head into a break. Before we do, we're just going to ask you to go back onto Slido, please. There should be two questions there for you. The first of those is, what are the biggest challenges facing low and moderate income savers in building good financial outcomes in retirement? And then there's a second question, what can we do to help resolve the challenges facing low and moderate income savers in building good financial outcomes in retirement? So if you could just take a minute to vote, the results should be cycling up on the screen. And as I said, we'll be using those to prompt some of the discussion later on. And then when you've done that, you may depart next door and help yourself to a coffee, and we'll be back here for the start of the next panel at 12 o'clock. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. So in this session, we will explore short-term financial security as a route to financial well-being in retirement. And so this session really is exploring how we as an industry, some questions should or could be interested in how we support pension savers in building overall financial resilience and health to give them the best possible platform for their retirement saving. I'm Gavin Lewis. I'm head of UK LGPS at BlackRock, and I'm pleased to say that I have assembled a team of experts to help me answer some very, very, very big questions. Someone said they love an anecdote, and I have a couple. But interestingly, my anecdotes are not about taxi drivers; they're about friends and my mum. Because I think when we think about like pension savers, it's a discussion that we had when we were in our prep session, which is really, really interesting. When we think about pension savers, we tend to think about a certain type of person. I think the archetype in the industry really focus on someone who earns well, is of a certain demographic, and really the focus is on asking them to save more. The challenge is that there's a whole other realm that I'm pleased that Nest Insights are really, really focusing on, because there's this concept of even saving at all. So to challenge this idea of emergency savings, for many people, like every day is an emergency. So a good friend of mine, my best friend who I grew up with, he grew up in Edmonton, I grew up in Tottenham and in the city. He's 45, he's a year older than me. He works in construction or manufacturing. And I have to be careful not to like whine at him and say, you need to save, because I work in the industry. But it's only now that he's now thinking about his pension. Only now. And forget about saving, because for him, he lives paycheck to paycheck because money is tight. And it's also very interesting hearing the previous panel, the discussion around, there's this whole other realm around attitudes towards money, which is not just in terms of where you work. I work in the financial services industry, and I had to have a very steep learning curve about saving. And to be honest, a lot of that came from my mum. So my mum's West Indian. She came here in the 1960s as part of the Windrush generation. And that generation weren't able to get credit or lending or savings via banks. And you could ask reasons why, probably a whole different panel session. But they weren't able to. So these saw West Indian credit unions set up. So my mum's attitude was always, don't give your money to the bank because you can't trust them. And that was handed down to me. So I always thought about, I didn't want to save, didn't want to invest, I didn't want to take risks. So there was just a whole mindset that I think we have to think about beyond the figures and beyond the statistics. At BlackRock, we launched the Emergency Savings Initiative, and that's a 50 million philanthropic effort to drive innovation and savings amongst low middle income earners. And some amazing stats here. 1 in 5 Americans, the program is run in the US, but 1 in 5 Americans will run out of emergency savings by the end of the year. That's this year. And nearly half, 48% of Black individuals have spent down their savings as a result of reduced incomes due to COVID. So these are statistics, but there are real people behind this. And again, I think we as an industry have to question what, how, and should we be resolving these challenges. So as I said, it's not just down to me to answer these questions. I've brought a crack team with me. And Joe Phillips from Nest Insights. Joe leads Nest Insights' public benefit research program, working collaboratively with partners across the sector to better understand the challenges facing savers on low to middle income incomes, and to develop and test potential solutions to those challenges. And Joe is one of the minds behind the Nest Sidecar Initiative, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. Ben Murphy from Atos. So Ben has over 10 years of management consulting experience within strategy and Big Four consulting. He has successful experience in defining corporate strategy and leading large-scale multi-workstream transformations in Europe, the Middle East, and across engineering, health, and financial services. And very interestingly for this conversation, as a director for digital innovation and financial services, Ben is responsible for working with Atos' financial services clients in transforming their businesses to become fit to meet the expectations of customers of today and tomorrow. So a real focus on innovation. And certainly last but not least, Ellie Sue of LSE and University of Oxford, who I might add is pregnant and made the trip down from Oxford here to be with us. So that alone needs to get a mention. But Ellie is a postdoctoral researcher at Centre, Department of Education at the University of Oxford, and is a visiting scholar at the Centre of Analysis and Social Exclusion, i.e. CASE, at the LSE and Political Science, where she completed her PhD studies. And in her thesis, she explored how people save for later in life and build wealth, focusing on the younger half of the British working age and population. And her paper is well worth a read if you haven't had the chance to. So, short-term financial security as a route to financial well-being in retirement. Can I ask my panelists maybe to address the audience and those at home, and just maybe offer some thoughts? And given, Ellie, your work in this space, I thought maybe we could start with you, if that's okay.
Hello everyone, Ellie Sue. Thanks for having me here. It's very important topic that we are going to talk about, especially because of the pandemic and effect of it. How we used to think about retirement saving, I think, is changing a little, because especially my research is on the younger half of the working age population, and because how we save actually is very different from how the previous generation saved. And later I will show you that it's very integrated in our daily life, and it's something that we need to think about from the financial well-being perspective. So I'm looking forward to sharing my research with you, as well as hearing what the other panelists have to say about the 3 questions later.
Ellie, I mean, I think feel free to take the stand and run through your presentation now. That'd be great. I think if you kick us off, and then I'll ask Joe and then Ben to come forward afterwards. Thank you.
Ellie Sue, from University of Oxford, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the role of financial resilience and in discretionary retirement saving. This research coming from my PhD research at the LSE. So let's start talking a little bit more about what happened, the big changes that happened in the last decade. We all know, we are all familiar with the shift from the defined benefit to defined contribution. So the younger generations no longer offered defined benefit, typically. And last 10 years, 2 very important policy changes happened. Automatic enrollment that came into effect in 2012, and then new state pension in 2016. These last 2 especially made retirement saving much more accessible to people by offering some sort of platform to work, save through work, and more people will be accessing their state pension. But what does that mean for the younger generation who will be retiring under this new structure? Is that there's more uncertainty involved in how we are saving and generating retirement income, because the outcome of how much we are going to save is really depending on how our savings going to do in the market through the time. So it's much more complex to work out, will I have a sufficient amount of pension saving done by the time that I retire? Will it generate adequate level of income? They are much more complex now to understand these questions. So Pensions Commission 2006, when they came up with a set of recommendations that form part of these 2 very important policy changes back in early 2000s, one of the important messages for the individuals, especially the younger generation, was that individuals need to save more from earlier on and via various means. So in academia, we like to think about, okay, so how do people save? And the role of income was very much at the center stage at that stage. It made sense in the previous pension landscape because income was very much a driver on how much you actually saved and whether you saved or not. Or if you look at from a psychological perspective, the role of myopia was something that people very much focused on in studying younger generations' retirement saving. The younger you are, the less likely to think about retirement saving because you have more time to think about that, as Gavin's friend, for instance. It is true. But by focusing on these 2 factors, what we are missing out is that we don't actually know how people actually save, what they think about, what it actually means, and how they come to think about it and decide to save. So this is where the financial well-being perspective that comes in. It's important to think about financial well-being because retirement saving is no longer just the money that we save through work. We are supposed to be thinking much more broadly about that. So financial well-being is important because, especially if you're thinking about financial resilience as a concept, it actually talks about people's individual internal capabilities that they can draw on, given their social and economic circumstances, and organize their economic lives the best way possible. And it's important to note that it acknowledges the influence of outside factors that might not be immediately under control of individual circumstances, controls, such as income. We like to all increase our incomes, but it's not directly under our control all the time. Putting this into the retirement saving context, financial resilience indicates let's say, a degree of how much of freedom we have, how much autonomy we have in the willingness and in the ability for us to be able to save for the future. This is a quantitative study that I've done using a survey called Wealth and Assets Survey. So this is kind of a map that I've used to examine. Here, it looks quite complicated, but it's not really. The bottom half actually explains that if you have a long-term view, then you're more likely to be financially resilient and also have thought about retirement saving, which makes you then to be more knowledgeable about financial knowledge that's related to pension, in turn, more likely to promote retirement saving. The important part of this model actually is on the top part, where demographic and socioeconomic circumstances, as well as what we have in workplace pension scheme and how we seize it, how it actually affects our confidence, are interacting with these internal values that we have, the more attitudinal values or maybe behavioral factors that we might associate with retirement saving. Let's look at financial resilience a little bit more closely. What does that mean? Higher level of financial resilience in my study is defined as someone who is more capable of sustaining oneself in case of income loss, more likely to be able to keep up with bills and financial commitments, less likely to run out of money at the end of period. It's the usual concept with the bounce back ability, that we can actually bounce back from this economic adversity, for instance, but also more likely to make sure the money is remaining at the end of the month, and less likely to buy on credit. So instead of just going on a whim, we will wait and plan for the purchase. Now, this seems to suggest that, okay, isn't that then very much about internal control and what people decide to do with their money? Not entirely, because the level of financial resilience was so strongly associated with household income and home ownership too, for the younger generation in Britain. So here I specifically, in the study, I asked two specific questions. So I have mentioned that we have overemphasized the role of income and we needed to really test it. Because I was looking at retirement saving outside of workplace scheme and state pension, what I call discretionary saving, I assume that there's some sort of decision-making process going on that is going to tell us a little bit more about the behavioral factor. This behavioral factor, of course, is the financial resilience that I was using. And what this study finds, yes, income is indeed very closely related to financial resilience. Yes, of course it is. It is an important factor. But what we need to understand was that financial resilience was controlling for income and other variables in the model, was the strongest predictor of identifying who have saved for their retirement in the past 2 years by saving some money into bank account. Now, another important point here is to point out here the red X, accounting for financial resilience, the role of financial resilience, and other factors in the model. Income didn't contribute further to identify retirement saving, unlike we have thought about previously. So this is really pointing out that we really need to understand the well-being perspective, how people come to save, and what it actually means as a mediator between the external values that we see, income, home ownership, and so on, that make us feel economically secure, to retirement saving. Another aspect that I earlier talked about was the role of myopia. Myopia basically means that the younger you are, the less likely to think about saving for retirement. Okay, then what about, given the strong role of social and economic environment on financial resilience, how does that relate to thinking about retirement? Actually, an industry report has said that economic security is a very important factor for people to actually think about start saving for retirement. Here, the study actually found that more than age, if we put home ownership, income, and availability of intergenerational transfer together, the explanatory power of this economic and social arrangements that one person has is more powerful compared to what age can tell about whether one has thought about retirement saving or not. This really tells us that it's important to consider the individual's perspective of where they are in their life or how secure they feel economically to be able to plan future far ahead. So in conclusion, these two findings point really to the importance of understanding financial well-being in the long run. And if you think about the flip side of it, means that retirement saving needs a little bit more holistic approach than we used to think about. And it cannot be actually considered in isolation by itself, as it used to be as maybe for putting a little bit more money into a workplace pension scheme. It needs much more holistic and organic perspective, putting together the short-term needs, how individuals feel, and how that enables them to think about retirement saving. So then I will finish my talk with a question. These then make us think about, okay, so how we used to understand retirement saving is very different from how the younger people are going to save for retirement. And we probably need to rethink about how we approach retirement saving for the younger generation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sue. So, Joe, thank you very much. It's fascinating because I think, like Ellie, it's just this idea of, it's almost this counterintuitive that, like, if you don't have money, it makes you save less, but actually having more makes you save more, when actually you would think that someone who was in that situation would be persuaded to actually save and invest more. So this whole idea, holistic view of financial resilience, like well-being, as you discussed, Ellie, I think is fascinating. So, Joe, I wonder if you can maybe take us through what you've been doing at Nest, and perhaps just give us an idea of this connection between saving challenges and this long-term idea.
Thanks, Gavin, and thanks, Ellie. So I'm going to spend a bit more time really agreeing with Ellie and looking at some of the other evidence of how this shorter and longer term financial security are intertwined for people. And then I'm going to share some of the ways that Nest Insight is thinking about that retirement saving in its broader context and exploring solutions that help people improve their overall financial well-being, supporting their capacity to save and to get to a good outcome for them in retirement. So Ellie has shared some research just now showing that low financial resilience today can threaten people's ability to save for their retirement. Higher levels of financial well-being in her study were shown to be a strong predictor of people's capacity to make extra retirement saving contributions. We know that people who are indebted, who have unstable income, or whose participation in employment is precarious and who have little or no savings available in times of financial emergency are less likely to be able to save for retirement. And that can sort of display itself in different ways. So people may opt out of retirement saving up front if they're automatically enrolled, or they may opt out voluntarily when a financial shock hits them, or they may not be covered or kind of even have access to that in the first place. And the impact of that can be that they don't get to an adequate retirement income for them. So this chart is taken from the Pensions Policy Institute's Underpensioned Index, and it shows that people classified in this study as Black, Asian, or of minority ethnicities and carers have private pension incomes just under 3/4 of that of the wider population, while the other underpensioned groups you see in this chart, such as divorced women, single mothers, and disabled people, are at risk of experiencing even lower retirement incomes. And there's a couple of things hidden in this chart. So the first is that sort of dark purple bar refers to self-employed people, and you can see that's only a little bit below the average there. But that picture looks much rosier than it's likely to be in future because of the decline in pension saving amongst that population. And secondly, that BAME bucket, as is usually the case, is quite a blunt tool and hides the fact that pension saving levels are lower for certain groups that are put into that bucket. So they're lower for Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Black people than that average suggests. And it also hides some of the intersections. So the intersection, for example, of gender and ethnicity, with women from these ethnic groups more likely to see retirement incomes that are lower still. And we've heard in the first session this morning that these are some of the groups who have been hardest hit by COVID. And this picture is likely to have got worse when you overlay those uneven impacts of the pandemic and the deferred impacts that we talked about earlier that perhaps we haven't even seen yet. People in already under-pensioned groups are more likely to be struggling now with low financial resilience and possibly unable to save for their retirement. And unless they can be supported to shore up their financial well-being today, their future financial well-being picture will also suffer. And then low financial resilience in working age life can also go on to devalue pension saving. So in the US, where pension saving is accessible at times of hardship, there's clear evidence emerging that those who didn't have a savings buffer in place were more likely to access their retirement saving early during the COVID crisis. And whilst we don't have that set up in the UK, where our pension saving is locked up for longer, there are some signs, and we've talked about some of it this morning, that there was an increase in people over 55 taking out all or part of their pension as a lump sum during COVID. And we also know that that's only part of the story. So in our COVID impact survey, we asked people whether they had used other non-pension saving that was earmarked for retirement during COVID, and you know, some of them had. It's also really key to face into the fact that what retirement saving means in reality depends on the financial state you reach retirement in. So clearly, if you have an £100,000 pension pot, that's going to deliver a very different retirement to a homeowner with other savings than it does to an indebted renter. The recent article here on the bottom from Hannah Fern in The Independent exposes, I think, an industry blind spot on this. She is astonished that the PLSA's retirement living standards don't include housing costs in their assessment of what income will be needed to reach a minimum standard of living. So she says, something feels very wrong, and it is. Dig down into how these estimates account for housing costs, and the folly is exposed. The assumption built into these retirement projections is that by the time you're ready to wrap up work, housing costs in the form of a mortgage on an owner-occupied property will have been reduced to zero. That reality is already, today as I write, past its use-by date. The idea that housing costs will ever be zero, she sort of talks about for people like me, is laughable. With fewer people in each successive generation reaching retirement as homeowners, I think there are some questions around whether some of the assumptions that we've built into everything from replacement ratios to default settings on pensions calculators still make sense for people. Too often, as Gavin sort of talked about up front, the pension saver our industry has in mind when designing solutions may be far removed from the realities of some people's lives with these complex and conflicting financial priorities. Historically, we've thought about retirement income adequacy as pensions, but I think, you know, Ellie's research and some of the other evidence suggests that we need to think about it more holistically, considering the whole household balance sheet. That means both the other areas of people's financial lives and I think also the other people in the household. And that means that saving more might not always be the lever to pull to improve people's outcomes. It may not be the best thing for everyone to do. We can't just focus on pension contributions and the need for them to be higher for everyone. And there are ways that we could look and we could innovate more broadly. I think really excitingly, we see in our work and in the conversations we have, and you know, some of those are with the wonderful people in this room who are working with us on these issues, there is an awareness of this interconnectedness and a widening of people's outlook in places. So this is a quotation from a FTSE 100 pension director talking at an HR and benefits conference recently. Increasingly, we are realizing that successful and sufficient long-term saving actually starts in the short term. At Nest Insight, we've been working on that link between short and long-term saving for a while in our sidecar savings trial. It's quite difficult to pitch this. Some people in this room have been working with us on the sidecar savings trial for years, and to other people I know it may be a newer idea. So forgive me while I do a recap if all this is familiar to you. We know that traditional financial products have typically been designed around single financial functions. So you get a product to borrow or to save or to pay or to invest or to insure yourself. The sidecar savings idea is an example of a hybrid financial product, which aims to start to address that problem of there being lots of financial needs and priorities that people face, and to bring two financial needs together in one savings solution. So in the trial, we're asking, what if you only had to take one step to improve both your short and long-term financial well-being? The idea of sidecar savings was proposed by a group of US academics who we're really delighted to be working with to overcome some of the behavioural barriers to saving. The version of the idea we're piloting in Nest Insights trial is called JARS. It's provided by Salary Finance with the savings account provided by Yorkshire Building Society. We've got some wonderful employers working with us who have made JARS available to some or all of their employees: BT, ITV, Step Change, Timpson and University of Glasgow. And for those of you who aren't aware, JARS links emergency and retirement savings in a simple payroll saving design. So the saver sets an amount to save per pay period, and they also set a savings target. And then their savings are just made every time they're paid automatically. They first make those savings into a liquid emergency savings account. If they reach that savings target they've set, so £1,000, £1,500, the savings start to flow instead into their workplace pension on top of any existing pension contributions they're regularly making. But if they take money out of that emergency savings account, then the savings flow back into it to make sure that they've always got that buffer in place before they make those additional pension contributions. And that means that people can just set and forget their savings with one decision. They know that they are building up greater peace of mind in the short term, but also that they will save more for retirement once they have that buffer in place. So early learnings from the trial are really exciting. We are very much midway through, but I think we are already seeing that this is a concept that appeals to people, particularly those who lack that financial resilience at the moment. So 6 in 10 employees at one employer here said they think JARS could help them when we presented them with some information about it. And that rises to 8 in 10 of those who are struggling with bills and commitments. I think there are always going to be people who are saving in other ways, but I think to see that 8 in 10 of those who are currently struggling like this idea is really positive. People who are using JARS talk about how easy it is to save automatically once it's set up, the benefit of never feeling the money in their pocket because it's taken from their pay before they get it, and just that peace of mind of knowing they're doing something, that they've got some savings in place. The early admin data we can see on the savings account also tells us that once people have set up JARS, they're saving persistently every pay period. And just over a quarter of JARS users have even made an extra deposit outside of payroll into their savings account. So people are starting to save, and then that becomes a sort of first step to saving more in other ways. We're also really heartened to see that people seem to be using their savings. So around 4 in 10 people have made at least one withdrawal from their emergency savings account, and some people have made multiple withdrawals. But because the average withdrawal is around half of the balance, we're still seeing average balances over time rising, even though people are accessing their money, we think, when they need it. So that means that over time, JARS users will automatically start to save more for retirement on top of their regular workplace pension contributions, but only when they've got that savings buffer in place. There's a lot more data collection and analysis to come, but we're really excited with these early indicators of how JARS is going out there in the real world. However, although we know that employees think JARS would help them, although we know it's had a positive impact, take-up is pretty low, although it's not kind of lower than other payroll savings solutions, so we don't think it's something particular about JARS. We can see the drop-off in one employee population here. So out of every 100 employees, 57 say, I think JARS would help me. 15 say they plan to sign up now or in the near future, but just 1 follows through. So that means that 98% of people who think JARS would help them don't sign up. So this leads to our next question and our newest area of work around emergency savings. What if it was easier to start saving than not to save? So we don't think the problem is that people don't want to build up short-term savings, and we don't think that the people is that people don't like the idea of doing that through payroll. We think it's just that people don't get around to it. Intentions don't translate into actions, as Tom was talking about in the earlier session. So someone says, I considered going for it, I just didn't get around to it. I meant to do it, but I didn't do it. And we think this is the main issue. And I think we can't pin all our hopes on the idea of sidecar saving if we don't fix this issue. We know that auto-enrolment made a huge difference in participation rates for workplace pension saving in the UK. Can we use that same mechanism, that same idea, for people who want to save through payroll for the shorter term? So we're really excited that we're currently working to develop a trial of an opt-out payroll savings approach to better understand how this could work. We should be launching that by the end of the year, working with an employer and with a credit union. And we're really looking forward to being able to announce that soon. We'll also be publishing a paper on some of the regulatory considerations. So just a couple more what ifs from me. The first is an area that we're currently working on as part of our research with the Department for Work and Pensions on how to support self-employed people to reach financial security in later life. And we're looking at more flexible ways to save than the standard routes offered by most pensions. So outside of payroll saving, most pensions, you can save a regular pound amount monthly or a one-off contribution. And we know that those ways of saving are not necessarily suited to people with variable and uncertain incomes, whether you're self-employed or in employment or not employment. So we're starting to look at what if your saving flexed, not just according to your income, but also to your available discretionary money, or even what if it flexed to your household's available money with the potential to balance out time out of work for one person in the household for caring or other health reasons. And by harnessing open banking and AI and machine learning, these innovations are possible. We can do things in these smarter ways. And beyond these current research projects, we're really keen to push the thinking further. So what if it wasn't all about saving? We're keen to look at how best to support people to manage the intersections between debt and saving, and to look in more detail at the relationship between those changing patterns of home ownership and retirement preparedness. We'd like to explore the impact of smart ways to help people pre-commit to saving once they've paid off debt, and models like that used at Abbott Labs in the US, where an employee still gets the employer's match into their pension if they're paying off their student loan rather than saving in the workplace pension. Just to close, I think we are really committed to looking from the outside in and putting that understanding of real people and households at the heart of our innovation work. We are so grateful to the organisations we're already collaborating with and the ones we're talking to at the moment. Doing new things is really not easy, especially in this industry, but the impact of getting it right could be huge. So if you'd like to work with us on any of those challenges or have any other ideas, please do come and talk to us. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much. And I mean, a few things leap out straight away. Maybe not surprisingly, the impact on minorities and marginalized groups. But also maybe, and perhaps reassuringly, this growing realization that actually taking a more holistic approach is the way to actually resolve this longer term savings crisis. But also just innovation and actually what is being done. Because I think it's easy to feel this is a very bleak picture, but actually technology in the world that we live in, maybe that's the way. And I think it's a really good segue to introduce Ben in his role and the work that he does, maybe to talk about just, to carry on where Joe left off, innovation, the future scope, where can we go from here?
I've got no slides, so you've got all of me. I don't know if anyone's looked at the side of this, but there's been some quite impressive people. And Joe, you kind of definitely picked up the mantle there, so thank you. Fascinating subject. So yeah, I guess I'm just giving a bit of background. I've worked largely in retail banking and more recently in life products, so insurance, reinsurance, across Bermuda, Australia and US. And I guess what I'm keen to do is just share some of the observations and pick up where Joe left off and really think about how innovation and tech can help in both the long term and short term to build resilience and I guess ultimately better savings outcomes for people as they get to retirement. I probably think about, well, as we started to think about this, really think about it from both an evolutionary and revolutionary perspective. And I'll focus firstly on the evolutionary because it's probably less controversial. And when I break down that evolutionary perspective, it's really building on kind of patterns and models we've seen before. I'd really see evolution in three ways. One is around data ecosystems and artificial intelligence. Next is around products and service innovation, and then finally around systems of innovation. And to sort of step through each of those individually, and firstly focus on sort of data ecosystems and AI. I'll just give an example actually, because it's the best way to illustrate it. So we work with a fintech, or one of many, small startup that span out of the Barclays program called Nevo. And what they are is a messaging platform. So similar to what you've got in WhatsApp, but secure and built for financial services. A great illustration of how they can use data and AI is, so they provide this messaging platform to financial service institutions to engage with customers. And they've built a loan journey. And the way it goes is, obviously, you go to the savings institution, you download the app, and then you start the origination process. So you want a loan. It goes through the usual stuff you'd expect, name details. What you're obviously capturing is doing the KYC, then a bit of intelligence, so the anti-money laundering, so PEPs and sanctions checks. We're then on to, photographing your ID, taking a selfie, and we've all seen this if you look at the likes of Monzo and Starling with a nice onboarding journey. But what that's starting to demonstrate is how data, so PEPs and sanctions data, standards around IDs can really assist in an onboarding journey. Now, what they've then gone on to do, which I think starts to demonstrate how with more and more data you can provide better and safer services to all, is they then use open banking. So they then say to the customer, okay, just log here, we want to have a look at your transactional data. Now, from a loan perspective, what that allows the organization to do is to really understand if they have any vulnerable customers within that journey. So am I about to lend some money to someone that's vulnerable? So they may have some habits, debt, gambling, that means that they're not going to be able to pay this back, or any other patterns that would normally want to see to really understand that individual. Now, the reason I bring that out is that final part of the journey, which has really enhanced the service available to customers, has come about through open banking. And so that the CMA, OB, and actually the banks themselves, I think, have done a really good job to start to extract and present to the market meaningful data that can be used to enhance services to customers. Now, what if something more happened on that? What if we built on that to start to make savings, investments data available? Am I getting value for money? How about, my household consumption? And then we can start to really understand financial resilience. Now, the more and more data you have, the more and more opportunity you have to apply AI, because obviously AI requires data to start to serve up new services available to customers. And if I move on to we're now talking about data ecosystems, unlocking that data, presenting it in a meaningful way that can really be used to present and provide new services to customers. I think when we think about the financial services and customer centricity in the financial services we provide, I think too often we think about nice user design, nice screen design, web apps, mobile apps. And I think quite often we miss the opportunity around the conversational components of customer service. Now, imagine a friend came to you and said, look, or sent you a message saying, here's a URL. And you went to the URL and there's questions like, how are you today? Thumbs up, thumbs down, great contrast ratios, on brands, great copy. Next question was, what have you done today? Went to work, multiple selects. When you come away from that conversation, how engaged do you feel as part of that conversation? Now, what's really happening, we talk about customer centricity and those kinds of services that we're, especially digital services we're offering to customers. But what's really happening is that the customer's fitting the process you designed. There may be multiple ones, but we're not really putting the customer at the center. And the reason I talk about this is I think there is that huge opportunity around AI, chatbots, conversational-based services. And I'll pull out an example of a service we provide, we opened up at the start of this year. So we provide, we deliver financial services for a large savings institution. And one of the things we released this year was chatbots, and that was obviously backed by AI. Now, what we found in releasing that, we were all very skeptical when we first released it, and everyone was very hesitant. We did back it up with lots of research and data. But what we found was that actually the customer satisfaction through the web chat channel, what then became chatbots and AI, it was artificial intelligence that started to handle this, and the customer satisfaction was massive. Now, what I found really fascinating was, for the same answer, customers could ask questions in multiple ways, very different ways a customer could ask a question. And then secondly, for unregistered customers, one of the biggest questions that was asked was, how do I save? So it wasn't really something we'd expect. And then at the center of that, when we looked at the question like was, how do I save? It was, you then start to think, okay, well, how do I answer that question? If I go to them, well, here's a fact sheet, you need to look at your outgoings, you need to look at your incoming. And then you can sort of base it on that. It's probably not answering the question you have. When we go back to releasing data, so if we can release that data, it allows us to provide much greater services to customers. The other thing that I guess, as we spoke about in preparation for this session as well, was really looking at what the rest of the financial services does compared to the pensions industry. And look, from a savings perspective, we quite often see a huge number of joint savings. And if you look at the industry, other industries as well, Netflix, Spotify, etc., they're providing services as a unit. You get the family accounts, you get the joint accounts, but that doesn't necessarily come through in the pensions industry. And certainly, discussion in our household at home, everything around current account outgoings is joint. Pensions aren't. The other thing, I guess, thinking about how technology and innovation can bring, greater short-term benefits to pension savers is really, I think, needs to come through the systems of innovation. So the fintech industry, which I'd say in large part has initially focused on retail banking. I think the last time I looked over a 5-year period, I think there've been 5 billion invested into it. And that was targeting a specific industry. So when we think about how do we bring innovation into this kind of arena, we need to really think about how we unlock that innovation capital and really incentivize people, businesses, startups to really focus on low to middle income, those that are more vulnerable. But also think about the channels of trust. There is that typical saying, and Gavin gave an example as well. But trust, takes a lifetime to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. And I think for a lot of people, there is a lack of trust around financial services, apart from when you go to the likes of Nest, Money and Pension Service, credit unions, where there's real transparency in what they do. So thinking about how one innovation can be unlocked, incentivized, but also channeled through the systems and businesses that are going to be able to use it and put it in front of the types of customers we're talking about. So that's how I would think about evolution. An evolution on current services and patterns that we've seen, largely around unlocking data, being able to use that data to make use of AI, to be able to provide new services, new products, and then really driving innovation through incentivization, through channels of trust that are already established. The other thing I mentioned was the revolutionary aspects of innovation and how it could help within this particular sector. It was a good talk when we prepped, so I thought I'd briefly touch on it now. But I think with all of the technology available, things like distributed ledgers, blockchain, etc., if you were to take that and hold on to that, and then say, okay, let's look at what the system as a whole is trying to do. It's trying to take owners of capital and route it to value producers and then return that value back to the owners of capital. With the technology we have today, there have been some attempts to maybe create a more efficient system. So lots of fintechs a few years ago did do ICO, initial coin offerings. So really thinking about tokenization of assets. I think for those that work in the industry, a lot of the time we're focusing on the customer side. So how do we improve the services to customers, ultimately bringing more capital into the system. But there's a whole host of service, what I would call rent seeking within the industry, that really brings questions of trust when people do start to see it. So it feels like sometimes that a lot of technologies have been applied to do what has always been the system, but do it quicker, rather than say, do we actually need this? You know, can we better unlock the tokenization of assets and the value, the return of value to those of owners of capital? And open question, I think, more than a definitive opinion. But if you were to take that perspective, forget about the inherent and systemic aspects of our financial system. Do we think we'd end up with the likes of settlement, custodianship, if you made best use of the likes of tokenized assets, central bank digital currencies, and the so on, open data and networks and AI? Open question. But that's my perspective. Back over to you, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. And I just want to assure you that I didn't prime Ben to talk about the role of capitalism and rent seeking in this presentation. He did it all by himself. So we will go to the audience for questions, and obviously those who are listening online, please do pose, and Michelle will read them out. It's very interesting, Ellie, Joe, Ben, hearing your discussions, because there is a clear thread running through like everything. The first is, Ellie, just challenging how we actually think about the saver and this idea of resilience. Joe, just like how some communities have been left behind, and then again for both of you, just innovation and how that resolves things. Yet none of this is new. Let's be honest, we are having this discussion, but this has been in existence for a very, very long period of time. What do we feel the next steps should be from either our industry or policymakers? And Ellie, maybe if I can just come to you in the first instance, if that's okay.
In terms of, from the policymakers' perspective, I think what is important to take away is that the saving is not only upon individuals' shoulders, that it is something that we need to think together with the state pension in conjunction with workplace pension and discretionary saving. So when we look at people with low level of financial resilience, I think the state needs to think a little bit think ahead, and plan ahead and help them save if the individuals aren't able to save. So for instance, I think there are many other ways that state can help. For instance, increasing state pension can be one of that. We do have certainty of an income, of course, but it's set at the very modest level. So that could be a first step. And second, maybe there could be creative solutions around maybe boosting national insurance contribution credits for those who aren't able to save, and so forth. So that could be one thing that we could think about.
Thank you. Joe, to you next.
It was interesting that the room and the people dialing into the live stream didn't feel optimistic about change coming out of COVID. I am a bit of an optimist, and I think the things that make me feel optimistic are some of the things that Ben was talking about, that what is coming on stream in terms of what we're able to do with data, with the acceleration of digital that Sarah talked about this morning, that people have kind of had to make transitions that might have taken a really long time before, that there is potential. But in terms of what we need to do to harness that potential, I think there's two things I see. One is that we need to take that outside-in perspective. We need to do more to understand the lived experience of households and how they are managing money and the challenges they face, but also the solutions that they are designing and deploying themselves. And then also we need to work across those silos, because you know, I'm most likely to go to that information or to that solution through the people and the services and platforms I already trust. And if the pension is not one of those, then that's not going to be where I go. But if pension saving is there in my bank account, in my lending circle, in my credit union, you know, I'm more likely, I think, to kind of join up across the different areas. And if you could plug into that the kind of smart look at my data to help me see how to do that, I think there's huge potential there.
Absolutely, and this idea of using lending circles or credit unions is just a fascinating example of other methods of saving or accumulating assets that can be tapped into. Ben?
Yeah, so thinking about it, yeah, from a policy perspective, I think firstly, just innovation needs to be generated. I think when you look at the fintech industry, you've seen Monzo, Starling, and all of the supporting services come through, but there's been no distinction in policy. So VC and private equities, you know, massively fueled a huge amount of that. But there is no distinction between which one you're investing to get those tax breaks. So actually, if we really care about this and we want to drive innovation and service to, you know, the type of demographics we're talking about, then actually policy, I think, needs to reflect that. And also just some encouragement around those innovation hubs. So we see, you know, the Barclays Rising Stars, Level 39, great areas for innovation. There are some, I guess, sparks of it. So I think a Resolution Foundation have started up Resolution Ventures and actually got some great tech in there, but scale-wise is tiny, relatively. So I think that policy, the tax breaks, etc., needs to reflect on that. I want to pick up on Joe's point because she spoke about, you know, being more optimistic about the industry, and I think I'd say the same. So I think one of the things we started to see is obviously a ramp up in ESG investments now. You know, some of us may question the underpinning data, but what is showing is from a consumer perspective, people are thinking more values-based than necessarily value. And part of that for a lot of people is, one, sustainability, the future of our, you know, future of our environment, future of our worlds, but also just wealth distribution and making it a fairer world for all. And actually, if that's the future of our economy, and if, you know, how we measure success and growth is through sustainability, then the types of things we're talking about, not leaving anyone behind in that future, I think is quite important. And yeah, just back to the point around the CMA, I think really hammered down on getting current account data out of the system. The industry and trade bodies have spoken about open data, but where's it gone? You know, it's when you go and talk to trade bodies and people in the industry, it's all a bit too difficult. But actually, they're all looking at their solvency. They're all working about how far ahead the solvency ratio they are and what they can return to shareholders. So if you can distill what is a complex product down into a single number, I don't see why you can't, you know, put some structure and meaningfulness around, you know, what is offered as a product and open it up so we know who's performing well and who's not, and how we get better value out of the system as well.
Thank you. One could conclude the industry is ripe for disruption. One conclusion we could draw. So we'll just go to the audience for some questions. We'll try to take one from the live stream as well. But anyone here?
Yeah, I'll do that first. Actually, it's a question from earlier today, which was, what do you think is the role of financial education in unlocking short and long-term financial security? And I would add to that, which I get to do because I have the microphone. What's the role for technology in unlocking some of that potential?
Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to start. I think there's a lot of evidence that education doesn't make as much difference as we would like it to make. But I think what is interesting to me is when you can overlay that around behavioural support. So actually, when I look in my bank account now, I can sort of see what I'm spending on different categories, and I can kind of get some sense of where my money's coming from and going. I think there are some really interesting examples of that information being used through open banking and AI to support people out of debt, for example. And I think where you have kind of taken the behavioural data and you can use that with behavioural support to support people to make changes, like education there feels to me like it might be more impactful than, you know, the kind of, here are some things you need to know and things you should do, which we know doesn't make a big difference.
Ellie, Ben, anything to add? Ellie? Yeah.
I'd like to add one quick point. Yes, indeed, academic studies show that education is defined very narrowly of transmitting knowledge one from another. Doesn't really make huge difference in terms of behavioral outcomes. I think the potential of financial education, for instance, at workplace or government campaign and so on, is actually using the power of socialization, getting people to talk so that they can actually learn from each other. And it becomes more common to talk about these things and actually encourage people to think about it. Perhaps this could be another route of financial education's achievement.
I should say we've got Marion from Timpson here, whose job title is Financial First Aider, and it's absolutely her job to talk to her colleagues and kind of help them. And I think that's a really good example of that idea of a kind of trusted network.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's a question at the back, Michelle.
Thank you. Ben Stafford from the Retirement Specialist Just Group. Just a question for Joe. JAR sounded brilliant, just the kind of impact-focused initiative that often is sorely lacking from a lot of the analysis, which often can be quite nebulous in terms of how you actually drive change. Can you tell us a little bit more about the opt-out approach that you're looking at for your trial and why you've decided on that?
Yeah, so as we've seen, we think what we're learning is that JARs, people think JARs could help them, and they think they're going to sign up to Save with JARs, but they don't get around to it. There have been other trials, including another MAP-supported trial at Capita working with Level, where they have really tried to make that sign-up journey as easy as possible and to incentivize that. And it's still difficult to get people to the point of sign-up. And I think because of where we sit in a world where auto-enrollment has been so successful in so many ways, we think that you could use the same behavioral mechanism to help people get started, so that if I do nothing, I start saving. I still have the choice not to save. If I don't want to save, I just opt out. To be clear, we're talking about that mechanism. We're not sort of talking about mandating this on employers or kind of anything more systemic, but just if an employer wanted to do that to support their employees to save, how would that be possible? So we've been looking into the regulatory aspects of that, including working with the FCA's regulatory sandbox, and we've been working with an employer and a credit union. The trial that we will start with is a trial with new joiners to an employer, so that at the point where they join the company, this is a new thing, and they will have the chance to opt out. But if they don't, they will start saving a default amount, which they can change from what's likely to be their second or their third pay packet. And the main thing we're looking to understand there is just what does that do to participation rates? You know, when people have the choice, but the way of exercising that choice is flipped, the default is flipped. What does that do? Do we see more people participating, and kind of to what extent?
Excellent.
You put in an envelope yet what you think the rate number of people going into JARs might be in this trial.
I think that's a great plan, Ben. I think everyone should put in an envelope what they think the participation rates will be, and we'll give a prize to the winner.
Okay. Last question. Sorry, just final question.
From Reddington. So we've got a massive government-led digital innovation program in pensions at the moment with the dashboard program. Be interested in the panel's views on what impact that might have on the industry.
Anyone have any thoughts?
Ben, do you want to go?
I can go first. I think from a customer engagement perspective, you're probably best to comment because you know how customers respond to pensions. I think sort of picking up on the lead from banking. I think I remember when it first came out, we all spoke about what the opportunity was going to be in these marginal gains of interest in current accounts that people were going to suddenly switch, and it never really happened. But what it has done is it has offered the opportunity, as you know, as a case example I gave, of being able to understand spending data. So actually, the values come in. So actually, I think Monzo. There's a great stat that says the best way to make most use of your money is to look at your bank account every day and to switch your utility provider. Just common fact, because you're overpaying, and actually looking at it every day drives certain behaviours. And Monzo have really buttoned down on trying to provide that, because you can switch your provider. Now, I think you've got more and more services that have gone on the back of using your spend patterns and data to look for opportunities on where you can save. So I guess my view would be presenting people with pension data is unlikely to be, being able to do some comparators is going to be probably not the first use case that's going to generate value. I think you'll start to see, as long as you can unlock that data and offer alternative opportunities that innovators are probably going to discover rather than other people. I guess that's what my view would be. Secondly, it needs to happen across the industry. It can't be an opt-in.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. And we are very short in time now. So can I just ask? We have obviously academics, industry representatives, policymakers, either in the audience or listening. Just maybe 30 seconds from each of you. If we are going to overcome this challenge, what key message would you leave the audience with? And maybe Ellie, if I can start with you.
I think when we come to think about linking short-term saving to long-term saving, retirement saving, I think the most important thing for individuals to think about is the possibility that it's there, that we need to recognize, okay, even if we can't think about it now immediately to put into action, perhaps the government and the workplace needs to work towards putting something aside for the people who can't actually save right now, so that they can always have this in mind that, yes, I am doing something towards my future. I think that's an important point, because the awareness perhaps is the what changes when they can then in the future can save, can actually put that into an action.
Excellent. Jo, what message?
Work across silos, look from the outside in, harness the power of technology, but couple that with real understanding of human beings and how they're going to use it.
And Ben?
Firstly, need to unlock data, need to make all data available. Fascinating topic from Jo. My immediate question is, what about tax? So actually the tax data are available. It's the periphery data as well around data ecosystems, AI, incentivizing innovation in the channels we're looking at and the distribution through trust channels and networks. And secondly, finally, we shouldn't walk past about the stuff we don't normally talk about, which is where a lot of the rent seeking takes place in the industry.
Excellent, great. Please thank my panelists in the usual way. Thank you.
My name is Matthew Blackstad. I'm the Analysis Director at Nest Insight. So normally I deal with all our projects involving analysis of big data sets, but I also do dabble in some of our research as well, and I'll be talking a little bit about that in a moment. Apologies to those of you who are expecting to hear Chris Evans from our partner supporter Invesco. Unfortunately, he was another one of the unexpected events, unexpected emails we got yesterday. Due to some personal circumstances, he can't be with us today. So I'm going to play the slightly schizophrenic role of both moderating the panel and speaking on the panel, but I promise not to give myself more time or easier questions. So just want to, as I say, to kick off a little bit, and I'm going to use my phone to read from because I have only just prepared this. But I thought I might sort of follow the pattern of this morning by starting with an anecdote. But rather than being about a taxi driver or about a friend, I don't know about any of you, but I haven't seen any human beings in the last 18 months, and it's really nice to be in a room with some now. So I'm actually going to tell a story about myself, and this literally happened to me during lockdown. I'm sure none of you will believe this, but I am approaching my 55th birthday in the near future. I know, thank you for that. I wasn't encouraging it, I promise. And I'm obviously a member of Nest. I have a pot with Nest, as you would expect. And some weeks ago, I received an email communication telling me to start thinking about when I might withdraw my pension. And now my job is literally working out how to make sure people sort of do the right things and prepare enough for their retirement. But I must confess, my initial reaction was, how dare you? And I think in doing that, I was probably on my own illustrating almost as well as anyone could one of the big tensions in this big battle that we were talking about this morning between inertia and engagement, between doing things in a passive way because we've been brought into automatic enrollment through an inertia process, and then what it takes to wake people up and get them to engage. And I was at that cusp when I received that email because I genuinely sort of hadn't got my head into that space at all. I'm very glad to have the email. Thank you to the Nest Comms team. So we were talking earlier on about the fact that there is a potential kind of challenge in inertia. We have a policy, as we know. In fact, one of the two big policies of the last 20 years, really, in the pension space in this country is all about harnessing inertia to get people saving. And we've been talking a lot at this event and many of our previous events about how effective that is. But as we also, I guess, know in the industry, the other big change in the past few years has been the freedom and choice reforms, which have put people in a position where they can basically do what they want within limits with their defined contribution pot when they reach retirement age, and as I found with that email from age 55. And there is, and it's been observed a lot before, there is within those two big policy changes some tension, because what we're basically saying to people is, we're going to rely on you just sort of following the natural path of least resistance to get you started on your savings process. We're going to nudge you by changing the default to making you save rather than not save. But then, you know, dial the clock forward maybe 40 years and you start approaching the time when you're going to have to take your pot out. We're then asking people to become very active consumers. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say we don't really know what needs to happen in between. So we're going to use that fact of a big choice to make at retirement, and hopefully, as we've pointed out earlier on, probably quite a lot of other choices people should be making quite a lot earlier in their life. In this panel, we're going to use that as the springboard to talk about where some form of more active engagement and getting people to wake up a little bit and think about their options might come in, and how that needs to work and how effective those sorts of interventions can be in the current environment. And to address those questions, we've got two very, very experienced and an expert panelist and myself, and we'll each be talking about a different piece of research that we think kind of looks at different aspects of that challenge. So in a moment, I'm going to ask our two panelists to speak. Dr. Priya Kambhatia is co-director of Health and Social Care at NatSen. She's got particular expertise in studying the needs of vulnerable groups and how to reach them through research. And Ellie Lugt is a senior advisor at the household finance team at the Behavioural Insights team. And as many of you may know, BIT have been working recently on Financial Capability Lab, which is a partnership with the Money and Pension Service, which has been looking at innovative behavioural interventions that we can try and introduce through the life course to get people to engage more with important aspects of finance like savings. So two very qualified speakers, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done with our partners Invesco, looking at the same set of questions. But Priya, if I could ask you to kick us off, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all today. Thank you very much to Nest for inviting me to come and speak to you about this piece of research. What I'm going to be presenting today is some research we conducted on behalf of the Department for Work and Pensions. And what I'm hoping is that not only you'll find the findings to be as interesting as I have, but also the questions that they highlight in terms of ongoing consumer needs. So this was a very large-scale piece of qualitative research. So we conducted 81 in-depth interviews. We had a geographical spread. We had an income spread as well. And most of our participants were aged between 50 and 72. And within that, we oversampled those that were 55 to 65 to capture experiences and views of those who were approaching retirement. So what we were trying to do in interviewing these participants was to address 4 primary research objectives. So our first objective was to try and understand individuals' views on adequacy of income in retirement. But we were also trying to understand decisions that people make in relation to their DC pots, what influences those decisions, and what support do they receive or do they need in able to make those decisions. So those were the 4 primary research objectives we were trying to address through the research. Next slide, please. So I'll go on to talk about the findings for each objective in turn. So the first one was in relation to our first objective around understanding what people's perceptions are around adequacy in retirement. What we found that consumers focus mainly on the independent phase of retirement. So where they would still be able to think very much about leisure pursuits and traveling and the costs that and what money you need to fund those types of things. So they were very much thinking about the independent phase and a phase when they don't have physical limitations. There was very limited evidence of any understanding or thinking around health and social care costs, either immediately or in the future, when they would perhaps be moving beyond the independent phase and when they might indeed have physical limitations to factor in. There's also limited evidence of early planning for retirement. So any kind of thinking around the length of retirement, retirement income, or potential pension income, that didn't really come in until very close to the point of retirement. And there was also a theme in our data around optimism. So people were very, very optimistic that they'll be able to work beyond state pension age. So this is not just in terms of they'll physically be able to do it, but they'll actually also have the opportunity to do it. So actually this optimism and this idea that they'll be able to work longer than maybe they will be able to help to push the perceived need to think about pensions and pension planning even further into the future. So the key question that we're left with is then how do we get consumers to think beyond the independent phase of retirement? So objective 2 and 3 are very tied together. You know, what decisions do people make and what are the influences on them? So I'll present some of the findings around those 2 together. So in terms of our findings on DC pension decisions, among those who decided to decumulate, their rationale for doing so fell mainly into 4 main categories. The first one was to top up income. So that was to actually meet essential needs. It could be to withstand a financial shock, such as job loss or divorce, or to fund lifestyle choices, so to go on that holiday of a lifetime. The second category was around supporting adult children. So that could be for them to support their children when they're in particularly difficult financial circumstances, or to be able to help them, enable them to get onto the property ladder, to pay for that wedding, to reach those key milestones. And the third was to do with investing in other plans. So this was about, in their mind, financial security. So they were trying to pay off their residential mortgages, potentially buying investment property, transferring funds into other savings or investment accounts. That was their route to financial security. And finally, the fourth category was to actually fund retirement, to fund semi-retirement or imminent retirement, either through annuities or drawdown products. Interestingly, what we found was that there wasn't actually a single factor or group of factors that was dominant across all participant types. Decumulation decisions were very much grounded in reasoning. It was very much, these are our circumstances, what is the best response to them? There was also this angle around aspirations. So not only aspirations for yourself in being able to fund a lifestyle that you have at the moment, but even potentially even a better lifestyle than you have at the moment in retirement, but also the aspirations of your adult children. DC pension pots were sometimes seen as saving pots. So particularly for those that were on low income and had low levels of savings, this was especially a risk. But it wasn't exclusive to them. Those who were relatively financially well off were also dipping into their DC pots to cover, to fund their lifestyles, basically, as you know, holidays being another key example that we kept coming across. And DC pots were still, of course, a retirement income for others, particularly for those who had yet to accumulate or those who had purchased a retirement income product. So what these findings do is they bring us to a question that I'm sure we've been dealing with all day at this conference and before, is how do we encourage consumers to see pensions as retirement income? So the fourth objective we were trying to reach was to understand and explore support received and or needed to inform these decisions. So what we found was there were 5 approaches to accessing support. I'm going to talk a little bit about those who didn't access any guidance or advice and use very minimal amounts of information. Within this group, some people didn't access guidance or advice because they thought that they were very financially capable. All they wanted to do was know how I can operationalize what I want to do. Others were very wary of the complexity of pension decisions and went ahead to accumulate, despite acknowledging that they're not that confident in the final results. What are the consequences going to be of me taking these decisions? And others were, of course, put off by the cost of advice, of accessing financial advice. Finally, there was a theme in there around mistrust and impartiality and mistrust of financial advisors, but also this time and energy that you have to spend in order to actually access support. And there was this idea that it was a burden, and in the busy lifestyles that we have today, it's not possible. So that was some of what we found amongst those group of participants not accessing guidance or advice. So finally, it was clear that consumers expressed a desire for the process of receiving support and gathering information to be simpler. They want it to be simpler to navigate across their pension pots, but also across different sources of information, guidance, and advice. There was this angle of mistrust and impartiality is important. And in the end, we highlighted the question, actually, how can we engage consumers earlier on in pension planning? Some of them are younger members of our sample who were between the ages of 50 and 55, expressed the desire that it would have been good to get more prompts, to get more information readily available, and some more advice and support earlier on in their working lives. So I look forward to picking up on some of the findings I presented here and some of the themes that's come up further on in the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Priya, for condensing a very comprehensive study in such a short and clear presentation. We'll come back to that, as you say, in questions, but for now, Ellie, can I ask you to do our second presentation, please?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people here in person. So I'm going to talk about the Stronger Nudge project that the Behavioural Insights team wrapped up last year, and it was looking at encouraging people to take up pension guidance. So as a bit of background, the Financial Guidance and Claims Act, as many of you know, requires pension schemes to refer customers to pension guidance, but take-up of the guidance is low. So the Behavioural Insights team worked with Aviva, Legal & General and Hargreaves Lansdown to test ways to increase the number of customers taking the guidance. The work was commissioned by the Money and Pension Service. So what we tested was we used a randomized controlled trial to test the effectiveness of 3 interventions. When pension savers called to access their pension or to inquire about their pension options, call handlers used a predefined script incorporating wording to nudge people to take an appointment. This was tested against a business as usual or control script, which typically involved signposting people to PensionWise website or the appointment booking line. So there were 2 Stronger Nudge interventions. The first one was booking directly. So this is where the call handler offered to book the appointment directly there and then for the caller. The other was a direct transfer. So the call handler offered to put the caller through to PensionWise, who would explain more about the guidance and book an appointment for them. Once the pension saver was transferred to PensionWise, call handlers then delivered a similar pitch, which aimed to nudge the caller to book an appointment. Both of the Stronger Nudge intervention scripts aim to apply each of the Behavioural Insights team's EAST principles. So that stands for easy, attractive, social, and timely, by simplifying the process of obtaining guidance, presenting the offer of guidance as just a normal part of the customer journey, emphasizing the benefits of the guidance, noting the positive experiences that others had had with the PensionWise service, and also making the booking as soon as possible. The interventions drew on research on the impact on behaviour of social norms, loss aversion, endowment effects, and reciprocity as well. So in terms of outcomes, we were interested in two key things. The first one was booking an appointment. So did the pension holder book a PensionWise appointment within 6 weeks of their call with the provider? And the second was going to the appointment. So did the pension holder actually attend the PensionWise appointment within 6 weeks? And what we found was that both interventions were successful in encouraging pension savers to book a PensionWise appointment. So the new approaches made people 4 times as likely to book an appointment. But the interventions did have similar success in increasing the incidence of booking rates. So there was no significant difference between those two. Then in terms of attending the appointment, both interventions were also successful in encouraging callers to attend the appointment. The new approaches made people 3.5 times more likely to attend the appointment. Again, there was no significance between the two interventions, so they had similar success rates. We also looked into whether gender, age, or pension pot size influenced either booking or attending an appointment. We found that none of these factors actually did have an impact. Alongside the randomized control trial, we ran an implementation and process evaluation, which included interviews with callers and focus groups with call handlers to understand how the intervention was working in practice. And this showed what we thought was some quite interesting findings. For example, that perceived pension knowledge was a key factor influencing the uptake of a PensionWise appointment. So as you can see in this diagram on the left, those who reported moderate levels of pension knowledge were most likely to accept a PensionWise appointment, while those reporting the most and least perceived knowledge were less likely to agree to an appointment. Customers with the most pension knowledge tended to decline appointments because they thought they'd done enough independent research already, and they wouldn't gain any further benefit from attending an appointment. And customers with the least knowledge had small pension pots in general, and found they felt that the only option available to them was to take a lump sum. So they didn't really see the value of taking additional guidance. Then customers in the middle of that kind of knowledge continuum, they either had some pension knowledge, but they were seeking additional advice and assurance that their pension decumulation decision was correct, or they had a little pension knowledge and they didn't have a predefined plan. So they were looking to explore their options. That latter group tended to benefit the most from a PensionWise appointment. We also found that the key factors influencing someone's perceived knowledge of pensions were prior research, as you'd expect, home ownership, owning additional investments outside of their pension, and life events such as bereavements or redundancies, which can prompt people to think about pensions a little bit earlier than they otherwise might. We also found that the most and least knowledgeable people were the most confident in their decisions as to whether to take a PensionWise appointment or not. During the intervention, call handlers also logged the reason for a pension holder declining an appointment. So pension savers indicated that several factors influenced their decision to not take an appointment. And the most frequently given reason was that they just felt that they already had sufficient knowledge. So of those who were offered a direct booking, just over half of the people said that they weren't interested because they already knew enough. Of those who were transferred to PensionWise, only just over a third said they weren't interested because they already knew enough. Also, in both approaches, about a quarter of people said that they didn't want to do it then, but they might do it later, so they declined an appointment. So I think this really highlights that people perceiving their level of knowledge to be quite high is a key reason why they might not take further guidance. So the implications of this work then, our qualitative findings suggest that offering earlier guidance while pension savers are still exploring their options would perhaps have been more helpful for at least some of the sample that we interviewed. These trial results have fed into draft regulations for delivering a stronger nudge to pensions guidance. And the government launched a consultation on these draft regulations in July, and they're currently analysing the responses. And it's worth saying that the stronger nudge increased the take-up of guidance, but numbers were still ultimately quite low. So many people still approach retirement without sufficient guidance, I think, even with this stronger nudge. And so we do need to keep investigating this issue with further research. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, let me know, and you can find out much more about the project on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. So I hope you can see from the way we set those two presentations up alongside each other that we're sort of trying to sort of piece together a picture of what's happening as people approach retirement, maybe without a heck of a lot of earlier engagement or support, and also to what extent you can place interventions at that point where people are at retirement and create a difference. And I think one of the things that we hear from both those studies is a sense that we could have done with doing something earlier. And so I'm just going to finish this set of talks by talking about one of a series of reports that we've worked on with Invesco, our partners, which is looking at ways of using language and message framing to see whether we can intervene and try and get people more engaged at an earlier stage in their life course. And the latest report is called Small Steps, and we'll sort of see in a minute why we've given it that name. But this report is very specifically looking at people in that group that I was characterizing myself in earlier, who haven't quite got to 55 yet, but may not be that far off. So people in their late 30s through to their early 50s. Because if we're going to get to people early, it really does have to be sort of in that sort of period. And the next slide shows that this is very much a collaborative effort. We work not only with Invesco and their US consulting arm, but also the US language research specialist Maslansky and partners. They're the ones who do all those amazing crawling worm graphics in front of politicians while they're talking, so you can see how every sentence and every word that they use has a different effect on people's feelings and responses. And we basically took those techniques and applied them to talking about retirement saving. And as I say, the report that I'm talking about here and the study that I'm talking about here very much focused on what we might call the squeezed generation, people in that sort of middle of their life stage. And we used a number of different methods, combination of the Maslansky language techniques and qualitative research and quantitative research. We also talked to a group of people in the NEST panel of NEST members who we use to conduct ad hoc research. So we're really trying to come at the question from a number of different angles. And as you'll see in a moment, got down to very, very fine detail in terms of the use of language to try and address the needs of this group. But just to talk, sorry, let's stick on that slide for a moment. Thank you. Our AI is anticipating which slide I need, but it just jumped ahead a little bit there. Just to stick on this population for a moment. Why are we calling them the squeezed generation? Well, as the graphic shows, this group of people in their late 30s to early 50s are very much sort of caught in the middle. A recent study from the ONS suggested that over a third of them are what they call sandwich carers, because they're supporting not only their children, but also their parents. And they're also squeezed, I guess more importantly, or as importantly for the purposes of this conversation, they're also squeezed in terms of their pensions. Because they're the generation who, and believe me, again, I know this from personal experience, who really only caught the tail of defined benefit provision through their employment, but have entered the automatic enrollment context somewhat too late for probably a minimum contribution rate to catch them up with the savings level that they need. So they sort of fall in between the two stools of DB and automatic enrollment. And there's a number of reasons, just anecdotally, to think that they might be a good generation, a good cohort to try and reach with some prompts to engage more in their pensions. They're sort of close enough to retirement that it sort of matters to that it's getting increasingly important to them. And actually, if you look at a recent study from the ONS, which I've forgotten who now. It's in my notes, but never mind. Recent study that we quote in the report that suggests that actually even economically it might not be a bad idea to start. Oh, it's the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I said the word economics and it came back to me. That it might not be a bad idea economically to choose to start contributing somewhat more to your pension in midlife rather than having a flat contribution structure through your life because your earnings are growing and your financial commitments may be easing off. So there's a reason to think this might be a good generation to start talking to about planning, but there are barriers, and that's what we wanted to explore in this study. And again, we wanted to see whether language and framing could help sort of overcome some of those barriers. So it is next slide now, please. And we think there's a window of opportunity here, genuinely, looking at our study. Interestingly, it's a sort of gradual, if you ask people, do they prefer not to think about their retirement? It's a gradually decreasing thing. So people in midlife are sort of a bit less likely to say they prefer not to than people who are younger, and a bit more likely to say that than people who are older. But what was interesting is we didn't see much of a shift in terms of whether they actually do think about retirement very much. So there's an opportunity there because they're open to it, but things aren't happening, or the levers aren't being pulled that get them to think that way. And so we dug a little bit into why, got them to talk about their experiences and their barriers. And on the next slide, what we've pulled out is really the three key barriers that we've identified in this report. And they won't be surprises to anyone, but hearing them articulated as we did was very useful. So the first one was affordability. 5 in 10 of the people we talked to said they couldn't afford to put more in their pension right now, or at least they feel they just don't have, day to day, week to week, they don't have the disposable income. Secondly, probably really importantly, it's just this feeling of being overwhelmed. There's so many different pots, with automatic enrollment, more and more small pots popping up everywhere. There's so much to understand about pensions, which are complex enough anyway. Just that sense of being overwhelmed and just not even knowing where I'm starting from seemed to be really, really universally there. And 4 in 10 people told us that. And then only 2 out of 10 people said that they were confident. So it's actually 8 out of 10 who were experiencing low confidence. And I'd need a simple answer that was, what do I need to put away each month? People are looking quite rightly for something really simple or a rule of thumb, and we're just not giving it to them because, again, it's hard and it's complex. So you put those 3 factors together, and they're kind of creating a perfect storm that's just getting in people's way, conceptually as well as practically, and emotionally as well as practically, to doing the things that they might need to do in midlife. So moving on to the next slide, we also sort of, I think it's a very strong feeling that actually this idea of being a squeezed generation is accentuating these barriers. They might be universal to everyone, but actually, if we talk to people about whether they have an idea of what their overall savings is, or if they know how much more they need to save in order to get the right level of income in retirement, they're actually less likely than both younger and older people to feel confident on both those fronts. And again, you can kind of understand that with all the competing priorities, all the different types of pension saving that are happening to them. They're not at the beginning of their journey, they're not at the end of their journey, they're in the confusing middle. So moving forward, what we were really focusing on as a study is how can we move people from the place of feeling sort of outside to feeling inside in terms of being ready and having a sense of understanding and a grasp of what they're doing. And we really think there's a big prize here if we can just get that basic shift of people not feeling overwhelmed by these barriers. Because when we looked at people who self-perceived as having lower pension knowledge and asked them how does retirement make them feel from this point in their lives, the sorts of words we were getting from them were worried, unprepared, frightened, depressed, with only a little bit of hopeful coming through. Whereas if we got people to looked at people who self-identified as having a higher sense of knowledge on what was going on, we saw hopeful, excited, relieved, calm, and just a little bit of worried in the middle. So that's quite a big shift just in terms of how they're perceiving, looking forward, what retirement looks like for them. So we do feel not only practically, but also in terms of the way people feel and their sense of self-efficacy, which is so important in getting ready for retirement. There's a huge benefit just to helping people through these barriers. And what we found, moving to the next slide and jumping to the results, is that what it seems to take is 3 key messages, which are roughly speaking arranged in a journey, a sort of messaging journey that takes people from sort of start through middle and to the end. The first one is you're already on your way. So just presenting people with what they already have, and there's a clear role here, for instance, for pension dashboards, proved immensely powerful, even just telling people what the state pension was worth, because people massively underestimated that right across our research group, can give people a foundation that they can build on, conceptually as well as in terms of actual economic wealth. Next was start from today and plan forwards. Now, we spend a lot of effort in our industry with pictures of yachts and beaches, although less of that these days, I admit, but trying to help people picture their retirement. And all the efforts that we've seen in the behavioral science field to try and get people to envision their retirement are trying to overcome the barriers that people have to thinking forwards to the future. What we actually found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is you start getting people to think with where they are today and what the next thing is that they could do. It was much more motivating. And we think there's possibly a role here for another behavioral theme, which is this notion of a goal gradient effect. So it's much more motivating to sort of see that you've already accrued something at the beginning of your journey than it is to try and think about what you've got to do to get to the end of it. So the classic experiment in this is if you give people a coffee stamp card with no stamps on, and then other people are coffee camps, which has got 10 unstamped holes, and another group of people, 10 unstamped holes and 2 stamped holes. It's the same offer, but the people who've already got 2 stamps are more motivated to get another coffee. That's what we're trying to get people to do. You've already got something, let's build on that. And then the third message was to say there are steps you can take. And interestingly, this was very much about getting people to take what we ended up calling a midlife MOT, and there obviously are such things out there that are on offer. But the idea being there are services out there that can help you put the pieces together. Why don't you go and use them? And I think that's the link to the talks you've already heard, particularly the strong nudge. And moving forward, what's really interesting in looking at that is that, I mean, these are only reported intentions, and we've seen many times today that what people say they'll do does not necessarily equate to what they will do. But for us as researchers, looking at how big an impact this had on people's intention to act, we think it's really going to be worth going out and trying to see whether these work in the real world. So 4 choices people might make here: using online tools such as retirement calculators, setting a savings goal, checking the balance of their pots, and increasing their pension contributions. What we're seeing there, you can't quite read the science, but between 17% and 22% increase in people's stated intention before and after they saw the messages that we crafted using that retirement journey. You can see all those messages in the report. I'm not going to have time to sort of break them down for you today, but I think you'll agree that's a pretty powerful effect. So just to summarize, final slide, please. And as given much more detail in the reports here, which are available on our website. But what I think it shows is that rather than thinking that this squeezed stage of life is a really tough point at which to reach people, we think there are tremendous opportunities to get there, and actually just some relatively simple changes to the way information is presented and the language we use to talk about retirement saving could make a really profound difference. And with that, I'm going to switch from being a presenter to a chair. Thank you very much. So with the usual chair's prerogative, I'm going to start by asking a question. I guess I'm going to ask it to myself as well. But a couple of things sort of really jumped out at me, sort of looking at the, excuse me while I scroll now, looking at the reports that you both produced and thinking about our own report as well. But I guess perhaps the most striking one is how little people are currently taking action. And I think it's one of the things we probably all feel in the realm of research and behavioral science is it's fantastic. We always feel very excited and a great sense of progress when we see that we can create an effect by using better language or by introducing a nudge. But ultimately, we are talking about a relatively small number of people still either in our midlife group or in the at-retirement group who are taking advantage of the information that's available to them. Do we think that we can ever achieve a sort of big enough change in terms of what people are doing through better language, better nudges, or does some more fundamental change need to happen that's going to more strongly nudge people into doing the things they need to do? Ellie, do you want to pick up on that first?
Yeah, I think we can produce quite major change through language and nudges, but nudges can be more than just language. You know, they can be something as profound as a default or a kind of auto enrollment, as we know. And so it depends on the kind of how the nudge is designed. But if in the case of sort of pension-wise guidance, if we had such a strong nudge as to sort of default people into pension-wise guidance, I'm sure we'd see a much more sort of dramatic increase in the take-up. You know, I know there would be lots of other sort of practical implications of that, but yeah, it would still be sort of applying behavioral science and seeing a much greater sort of take-up. I think you're always sort of trying to balance feasibility and practicality with the impact that you expect to see when applying sort of nudges to this stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And Priya, I mean, I think you saw very much in the same way as Ellie, this sense that people, to some extent, already made their mind up, or people had a maybe misguided sense of their own level of sort of knowledge and understanding. But how do you think we intervene in a way that can help shake people out of that without maybe putting them off? Because it can be pretty depressing seeing what your real situation
is. So obviously, our project was about understanding the decisions that people made rather than making a judgment on whether they'd made a good decision or not. But that being said, when we looked at our evidence and our data, it was obvious that we could see that there's some people may end up being very vulnerable or may not have, you know, may have made a decision that could be very difficult to come back from. So there were a few things there. There was, I mentioned around being able to navigate across pension pots and of course the pensions dashboard and other dashboards that are already available by providers may make a difference with that when that's there. but also bringing together information, support, guidance, advice, all of that in one easier way to access across those different sources. That was also highlighted. Yeah, it's a difficult one. There was definitely, as I also mentioned, that there was a desire for information earlier on, which amongst that 50 to 55 group, and said if I'd been brought on that journey a little bit earlier and had those prompts and had that information, then perhaps it would be easier to get me to start thinking. Because a key theme that came out of our data was no one's really thinking about it until they come very, very close to retirement. So it's a key problem that's not easy to solve.
No, indeed, no, and we certainly in the work we did, we saw it's not too late as being a really, really important message to the sort of group of people who haven't yet reached that stage. But equally, as we've seen and as the data show, it is increasingly difficult the further people are from that date to get them to act. So you're in a bit of a cleft stick there. I'm going to throw out to the audience for questions as well. So you're welcome to ask me one as well. And do we have any in the room first of all? Darren, why don't you start?
Thanks very much, and 3 great presentations. So I'm going to go back to a theme that we started the day on, which is engagement versus inertia. And we've obviously done a lot of work on the accumulation side of things in terms of changing defaults and all of that. I'm just really interested in the panel's views from the research that you've done, in the question of to what extent do people just want stuff done for them? Yeah. So fundamentally changing the default versus, the facilitation, the education, the guidance to guide them through their decisions. Because again, we've got that sort of juxtaposition of those interventions. And, we obviously know that the Minister, I'm looking at Pete now for some reason, I don't know why, is obviously keen on ideas like CDC, and, will we see, more interest in ideas like collective defined contribution, risk sharing, almost defaulting people into an income while giving them the option to use the freedom and choice that they've now got. So just interested in the panel's views on that.
So I'm just going to summarise you, Darren, if I may. I think there were 2 questions there. The first one was we've moved to a position where we kind of do things for people on the way into the pension system. Should we be doing things for people sort of as they reach retirement and have to translate their savings into income? And then the second one was, will that mean that some sort of collective system like collective defined contribution will be a better sort of vehicle to help people not have to make their minds up? I know neither of you are pension specialists necessarily, but do either of you want to tackle that from either of those directions?
I think there's more to be done to default people in the kind of decumulation space, as we have seen the success of in the accumulation space. But I definitely, I wouldn't kind of see it as either or necessarily. I think it's really important to have that freedom of choice, even if you are defaulting people's behaviour, and to ensure that the information is out there, so that they don't feel like you're taking decisions for them, and really important life decision as well. But I think, in the case of PensionWise, for example, there's lots you could do to default people into guidance. You're kind of getting a bit of both in that sense. You're getting a hybrid.
Brent?
Darren, what you started off by saying, to what extent do people want stuff done for them? So I think what you were saying about inertia versus engagement, it seems that it was understood amongst the participants that it seems to be an abrupt thing where suddenly now I need to engage in this. And certainly amongst the lower income, less highly educated groups, that confidence, that understanding of this is, how am I supposed to make these decisions? How am I supposed to understand this landscape? And I've never got involved with it before. So I think there is scope for supporting people and maybe having stuff done for them. Yeah.
And I'll just echo that as well. And a few years ago, before I moved into Nest Insight, I was involved with our investment team at Nest in some research that some of you may have seen that led to our introduction of the idea of a retirement blueprint, which is effectively to have a quasi-default solution for how you accumulate your money, even if you've got a relatively small pot, as many of our members will continue to do. But one crucial aspect of that, and it very much was rooted in that research, as well as our own sort of concern for making sure people didn't have the wrong outcomes, was to say the first period of your retirement, maybe 10 years, you talked about the active phase of retirement periods being something that people find it easy to focus on in the short term, but then may change their minds later about what they want next. During that phase, we felt it was very important that people could kind of pull out and make their own decisions. So again, I think I'd agree with Ellie that it may well be possible to offer people something which feels quite like a default as you move into it, but which still gives them a lot of decision-making power and a lot of control as they move forward. Any more questions? Yeah, Peter over here.
Matthew, just linking where you showed the graph with the sort of ages and that squeezed middle age range, do you think, because you talked about the changes in the pensions or regimes and so on, is that difference due to the different experiences that those different age bands have had, or is that actually just a sort of natural progression that age bands that people move through as they age? So the current 20-somethings that are quite optimistic may in 15, 20 years' time find they've got mortgages and families and all that they haven't factored in, and then what seemed like something they've got loads of time to prepare for suddenly seems to be looming and so on. So is it just like a natural curve you move through over the course of your life?
Yeah. I mean, we can only speculate about that, particularly because we didn't have a baseline for sort of, in the previous pensions regime to see whether anything was different. But I think just to make another back reference to what we heard this morning, the other Ellie doing a presentation this morning talked about the fact that actually age is a significant driver of how people feel about whether or not they want to engage in their pensions, but it's only one, and actually other aspects of their financial and economic circumstances have very strong effects too. So one of the things we've been quite careful to do here is not be too rooted in the age group, but more think about the stage of life that people are at and whether aspects of that might be affecting the way that they think and feel. And there definitely is that sense of, it makes a difference whether the kids have flown the nest. It makes a difference whether you're in the middle of paying off a mortgage that there's a long way to pay off. We absolutely didn't go to enough depth in this study to be able to break that down and think about what was causing that. But my guess would be that what you're saying is right, and it's to do with the experiences that people are having at that stage in their life rather than necessarily at that calendar age. That's the thing that really affects that perception of being squeezed.
Thanks. And I guess just on that, then there's some implications about those life stages changing where they fall chronologically. Just people, first-time buyers are getting older, new first-time parents are getting older, and so on.
Well, I mean, not just changing chronologically, but sometimes changing fundamentally for different cohorts. So, I mean, we talked again in this morning's session about how for the younger generation today, a lot of them may well not reach the life stage where they paid off their mortgage and are moving on to another phase of life. So these things are constantly shifting, and I think you have to keep redoing this kind of research to understand that. Got a question over here. Carla. Oh yeah, and then we'll go online.
Yeah, really fascinating presentations. In fact, my question probably bounces off of yours. A class of messages that could help engagement is popping into my head. And I think somebody must have tested this about telling people that the systems have been changing. So, okay, we've had DB, we've had automatic enrollment, so that people recognise that what they intuit about what's going on might not be right. What they speak to, sort of taken with people, talk to their family, their friends, their colleagues. If those are participating in a different system, are we alerting people to the fact things have changed? If people participated in one system 20 years ago, are we telling them that actually we've changed state pension age, we've changed the state pension? I've been speaking as somebody who works on state pension reform. This is something that comes to mind. So yeah, I'm interested in whether it would be helpful to talk about that cohort effect and the changes that have been made by industry and government to help people to think more about decisions they've got left.
Do either of you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, so what we did was as an enabling tool in our interviews that we were having is we had alerted all participants that there will be, we're going to be talking to them about the pots they have, their employment history, at least something that they might want to gather information, not necessarily to show us, but to aid recall. And then we had done timelines and we worked through the timelines with them to kind of help them map it all out in their minds. And it was then through that exercise that they were realizing, oh, I have got a DB pot, and I've got that other DC pot I forgot about, and I did take that cash withdrawal, and I had mapped that out. And so that's the thing that sticks out in my mind in relation to what you were talking about. But that was through, that was through an encouragement to, and that was because they had actively opted in to participate in our research. That's a very specific type of people, but I'm not sure that everyone would do that and follow the exercise to understand, where they sit and how their situations can be different to their friends and their colleagues and their family members.
Yeah, I'm not sure of any research that's actually looked into this, but I think it'd be really interesting to kind of test different ways to tell people about the changes and about how to communicate the changes, especially as we know as kind of peer messengers are so important. And yeah, just how to kind of simplify that as much as possible. So yeah, I'm not aware of any research, but it'd be fantastic to do that in the future.
Yeah, and I think as we also heard in Katie Miltman's talk, this idea of getting people involved in sort of peer discussions can be a really, really powerful tool. Michelle, do you want to fire us some off online questions, if that's the phrase?
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple of questions from our online participants, one for Priya and one for Ellie. Sorry, Matthew. To Priya, did you find differences in how people use and view their pension pots based on the size of the pot? And the one for Ellie is, of those who declined to take up an appointment because they felt they knew enough, did you test that awareness and understanding?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. Did I find differences in it with participants who had different size pots? Yeah. Okay, it was more around how many pots they had and the collective value of their pot once they had followed that mapping exercise that I was just talking about, than it was around the size of the pots. Yeah.
And those who declined an appointment, so we did do one interview with someone who declined an appointment, but it's not enough to kind of extrapolate from. But we didn't compare we've not done any sort of evaluation of the effectiveness of the guidance. So we're not kind of able to make those claims, unfortunately. But we'd be really interested in understanding a bit more why people decline appointments and the impact that has on them, and kind of comparing them to those that do receive an appointment and attend.
I'm going to come to the room again in a moment, but if I can just be sneaky and ask another chair's question or introduce another topic. I'd be really interested to hear your views on this, both of you. One of the things that we really noticed in that previous research at Nest that I mentioned, where we were talking to people in the approach to retirement about what they'd like to get from their pot when they retire, was how much people seem to be experiencing exactly the same biases that sort of 25-year-olds are experiencing when we try to get them saving in the first place. In other words, this thing about people when they reach, say, 67, whatever their retirement age is, only really being able to focus on the active phase of retirement and not really being able to think towards their longer term needs is kind of classic example of short-term bias and short-termism. And they're very much kind of operating under conditions of uncertainty because they're going through this sort of massive life change that's like nothing that they've ever seen before. And there was also a lot of sort of preference for certainty. And there was also a lot of, we could see a lot of regret aversion really driving people. In other words, they didn't want to experience buyer's remorse if they went into, say, an annuity, and then they suddenly decided a few years down the road that was the wrong thing for them. So it's almost like a sort of laundry list of all the same behavioral biases. And so just interested to hear from each of you whether you saw similar things in your study, as well as what you've already mentioned about that short-term focus on the active phase of retirement, and whether you think this might mean we need to be intervening at sort of other stages and throughout people's retirement to really help make sure they're continuing to be able to focus on their needs at each stage.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So in this study, the average age of the person in the study was 62, and the vast majority of people were calling about a specific decumulation option. And they were very much focused on that active stage of retirement, and they weren't really seeing it as a long-term source of income. So I think it's a really interesting point that we kind of, as far as possible, we need to investigate other touch points for later on in retirement, and ensuring that messaging is really clear as to how to plan for that next stage of retirement, definitely.
Yeah. So I think there is research. There's been research conducted on on how personality changes in later life, and how there are some changes after a certain age. You become, you're I think less narcissistic, and there's some sort of minor personality change that happens, but in general it ends up being fairly stable, and that's in relation to what you're saying about how biases kind of follow through. So I think the touch points at various stages is really important. I think this message of retirement income on your pension pot being there to fund retirement is a really important message that needs to come out at the earliest. Yeah, there was, that's definitely was highlighted in our interview data, yeah.
Great, thank you. Got a question, a persistent question at the back there, so then let's go over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Ben Stafford from Just Group. A number of organisations have suggested a further evaluation trial to see the kind of impacts that auto-enrolling on a non-mandatory basis people into the pensions-wise appointment, given its excellent feedback around age 50, so deliberately ahead of the point you can access, would be useful to actually test the hypothesis. Would this do more than the stronger nudge, given that for the fact that we achieved a marginal uptick with the stronger nudge in the appointments to the trial, it's clearly nowhere near close enough to the norm that's being sought. So I'd be interested in your views on that, an auto-appointment trial, non-mandatory, around the age of 50 to assess the impact that would have on appointment take-up, given the significant gap that still seems to remain.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept, and I think we would see a huge impact, as we do in auto-enrollment of lots of different things and defaults in lots of different domains. I think there would still be a challenge in terms of the actual practical implications of that, and ensuring that PensionWise actually has the capacity, and capability to make sure that all of those appointments are still effective. And also, I think that people, even if they're auto-enrolled to book an appointment, they still need to really see the value of it and ensure that people actually attend and get the most out of it that they can. So I think it would be, we'd aim to supplement just the auto-enrollment with further information to make sure that people know what they're being enrolled into.
Is that a question, Will, or is that trying to pick up? Because we've still got a few minutes to go.
Excellent. I've seen research from other countries that suggests that people with lots of small pots are more likely to take them as cash, and people with a smaller number of large pots are more likely to take them as an income. I think, Priya, there was a bit of that.
Yeah, we did find that in our study. Yeah.
So just interested in your views on whether we would see very different decisions, whether there's any evidence you've seen that we would see very different decisions if people were encouraged to have consolidated their pots along the routes to retirement.
I think so. I think we would. Yeah, in short, I think we would, and I think it would encourage people to. I think it's that whole thing about what is the holistic situation here. We were looking at household situations. We were talking, we're talking about adult children. What is our overall financial situation, and not just financial situation, but have you got an investment property? All of the whole thing together. So in terms of when you can see that bigger picture, it might be. I know it has been suggested that it might be easier to make more informed decisions. Yeah.
Ellie, have you seen anything similar? The idea that a lot of small sums is less sort of meaningful and less sort of driver of planning than one very large pot?
Not as far as I'm aware, no. But that is really interesting. Yeah, we've not looked into that.
It does lead me to another question, though, that I was going to throw at you, because I thought it might come up from the floor anyway, which is I'd be interested to hear from each of you whether you think that the arrival of pension dashboards, which is an opportunity for people of any age to see that aggregate sum, whether that's going to make a significant difference to this sort of level of preparedness that people come to this retirement experience with, and also whether you think on their own they're going to achieve that, or whether, again, we need stronger nudges to get people to take advantage of a dashboard. Priya, do you want to?
Yeah,
start with
sure.
that?
I mean, I think, as I said, there is that want and desire to be able to see your pension pots all in one place. And we're moving to a place where there is no such thing as a job for life. People are having more and more jobs and then collecting different employer pensions as they go along. And so it might become more and more important that you're able to go to one place to be able to map out what your situation is. Pension dashboards, yes. There was some mention of it in the data saying that we know that this is going to come out, and it may be something that we will be able to draw on, but really it didn't come out that much in relation to sort of fintech and digital tools and being able to, so I think there's a long way to go still.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Priya that I think pensions for many working people today are going to be more complex than ever, and the pensions dashboard is a great idea to simplify that information and make it much more engaging. So I think it will have a great impact, but you know, we do have a long way to go. So I wouldn't say that there's a kind of one silver bullet that will fix everything, and pensions guidance will likely still be necessary as well.
Great, thank you. And I think we've got time for just one more question from the audience, which is
given a microphone.
All the way over here. I'm very glad they did that because you're way outside my field of vision.
Thanks. Pete Searle from DWP. Just tying a few little threads together there. So we start where Darren did in the conversation then, and the 50, at 50 pension-wise point. I think it's a really good point. So I certainly think there is something around using nudges and inertia at the decumulation phase. There's more we can do. And I do think at the moment, pension-wise, it's geared, it's designed. The whole purpose of it is you're making a decumulation decision. So the guidance is about that. So I think at 50, it would be a different thing, but I think it could be really, really valuable actually to get people to think more broadly at that point and warm themselves up for decumulation as well as thinking about accumulation. I do think defaulting auto-enrolling to appointments, as you pointed out, Ellie, only gets you so far because you can drag someone to a chair and sit them down and strap them down and someone can talk at them, but it doesn't actually make them engage and behave differently as a result. So I know that Stephen Timms, for example, advocates that sort of auto-enrolment, auto-appointment. We've gone further than your research did in our even stronger nudge, but I do think auto-enrolment in appointments is probably a step too far, so I don't think it's productive. Could even switch people off. So it's finding a way of getting engaged people, getting that guidance and being receptive to it.
So just to pick up the question from that, I think that's particularly relevant to both your research is ultimately the strongest nudge would be, as you say, Pete, to sit people down in a chair and sort of talk at them, which clearly we're never going to get to that situation. There's some things you can't auto-enroll people into because practically you'd have to physically drag them there, and that's not auto-enrollment, that's coercion. So how far can you take that notion of creating strong nudges into this sort of service?
So in terms of using kind of default language, that you can have a much softer default. You can say things like, we've already booked an appointment for you, and they kind of opt out. And they're very free to opt out, and they're also very free to not attend. But I think if you give them the right information and make it clear the value of the appointment, and also incorporating some elements of defaulting into your messaging, then that could have an impact.
Thank you. Priya, you agree?
Just to say, I mean, and Ellie's more qualified than me to talk about sort of nudges and touch points and things, but there was a strong role for employers to play in those nudges and in that information and sending those messages that you need to be thinking about this, and this is and why you need to be thinking about it, and this will signpost you to advice and guidance. And yeah.
Great, thank you. And actually, raising the role of the employer takes us back to previous session as well, talking about financial capability and emergency savings too. And there's probably a whole other panel to be had on the subject of the role of the employer in helping here. But we've reached the end of our time. Thank you all for your excellent questions. And if you could please thank our panelists for their excellent presentation.